Gendry woke long before dawn on the day his life would change, rising from the rough straw pallet in Tobo Mott's smithy. He was used to early mornings. There was never a shortage of tasks for an apprentice. Firewood needed hauling. Hot iron waited to be hammered into shape. The smell of char and molten metal was as familiar to him as the warm presence of a dear friend. Gendry had always known he was a bastard. He had grown up with that knowledge ever since he was old enough to understand what the word meant. What he did not know was that a single object hidden away in the dusty corners of the Red Keep's labyrinthine storerooms would spark a series of events that would upend his very identity and shake the Iron Throne. He spent the first hour of the morning wrestling with the bellows. The forge's coals needed to be stoked to a perfect glow, almost white-hot if he was to work the heavier blades on the day's docket. He was big for his age, broad in the chest, thick in the arms, and surprisingly tall, a trait that had earned him a few suspicious glances from the master armorer when Gendry was still a boy. His black hair curled close to his scalp, and his eyes were the piercing blue of a summer sky. Some said he resembled King Robert Baratheon in his youth, though Gendry rarely thought about it. He had always been too busy to dwell on silly rumors, and if he ever dared ask Tobo Mott about his parentage, he was usually met with a dismissive grunt. That morning, the smithy was even more crowded than usual, with half-finished helms and breastplates commissioned for the city's gold cloaks. Orders from the Red Keep came thicker with each passing day. King Joffrey had not sat the throne long, but his whims and demands were unpredictable and frequent. Gendry had heard there was talk of war. Lord Tywin was rumored to be moving in the west, and the Riverlands burned under the weight of Lannister aggression. Already caravans of refugees were trickling into the city. In the flickering light of the forge, Gendry started hammering out a rough shape of a short sword's blade. Sparks flew every time his hammer struck. With the clang of metal echoing in his ears, he found himself thinking about the rumors swirling throughout King's Landing. The nights at the local alehouses were full of talk about King Joffrey's true parentage, about how the boy had hair of spun gold, like the Lannisters, rather than the dark hair so typical of House Baratheon. Gendry had never thought anything of it. Born a bastard, he had no illusions about fancy bloodlines and politics. Life was simpler for him behind the anvil. Even so, he had overheard Tobo Mott once telling a visiting knight that Gendry's mother had been a tavern wench who died when he was very young. For reasons Mott never cared to explain, Gendry's apprenticeship had been well funded by an anonymous benefactor. For so many years, he had accepted the story and let that be the end of it. His mother was gone, his father unknown. He was just a bastard, one of countless bastards who scratched a living in the teeming slums of King's Landing. He never considered that something might be different about him, nor did he suspect there was anything else to learn. Life had taught him not to ask too many questions. But by midday, when the clamor of the morning had subsided, a messenger from the Red Keep arrived. The man was tall and gaunt, draped in a simple brown cloak, clearly a lower functionary. He approached Gendry with an air of indifference, as though dealing with another worthless city rat. "You boy, are you Gendry?" he asked, scanning the smithy. Gendry shoved a newly forged dagger into a barrel of water. The hiss of steam rose around them in a thick, hot cloud. "I am," he answered, wiping sweat from his brow. The messenger gave a curt nod. "You're required up at the Red Keep. Report at once. There's a matter of some interest to the crown." Gendry looked around, half expecting the messenger to laugh. Why would the crown want him, of all people? Still, Tobo Mott appeared in the corner of the smithy, his arms crossed, watching with hawkish eyes. The master armorer gave Gendry a faint nod of acknowledgement, as if confirming that this was no jest. The young blacksmith set aside his tools, cleaned his face and arms as best he could, then removed his leather apron. Without a word, he followed the messenger out onto the bustling streets of King's Landing. He did not speak much on the way. The messenger, apparently in haste, walked with a determined stride. Gendry's mind swirled with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had he done something wrong? Some old job that Tobo Mott had given him might have ended up flawed? Or was it something else entirely? They ascended the twisting roads up Aegon's high hill toward the Red Keep. The stench of the lower city gave way to the mildewy odor of the castle's ancient stone. Crimson banners bearing the golden lion of House Lannister snapped in the breeze above the walls. Joffrey's personal standard now, as both a Baratheon and a Lannister in name, though the crowned stag of House Baratheon was hardly in sight. Instead, there was the new sigil that combined lion and stag, but even so, the colors remained dominantly Lannister gold and crimson. Gendry had never been within the Red Keep's walls. The first courtyard they entered was alive with activity. Pages and servants scurried to and fro, while columns of guards in shining armor moved with martial precision. The messenger motioned for Gendry to follow him through a side corridor, down 2 flights of stairs, and then into an old storeroom far beneath the great hall. It was a strange place for an audience with anyone of import. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams, and the dim torchlight revealed boxes, barrels, and crates stacked haphazardly, as though no one had bothered to keep track of their contents in years. 2 men waited there. One was an older fellow, robed in the dusty black of a steward or record keeper. He had a wiry build and a balding pate, and when he looked at Gendry, there was curiosity in his eyes. The other man was the Hound, Sandor Clegane himself, standing in menacing silence. His burn-scarred face was half in shadow, but Gendry recognized him instantly from the times the Hound had accompanied King Joffrey through the city. The Hound did not speak, only glowered at Gendry with an air of vague disinterest. "You there, lad?" said the robed man. "Close the door behind you." Gendry complied. "So you're Gendry, are you?" "Aye," Gendry answered. He sensed his heart beating faster than a trip hammer. There was something odd about this situation. The gloom of the storeroom, the presence of the Hound. This was no normal errand. The robed man pointed to a stout old chest behind him. It was half-rotted, with iron fittings rusted to nearly nothing. A faint crest was etched into the wood. A crowned stag in mid-leap, though time had blurred the outlines. "We found this while clearing out old records, and his lordship," he said, glancing at the Hound, "thought it might be of interest." Gendry frowned, taking a hesitant step closer. "Why would it be of interest to me?" The robed man exchanged looks with Sandor Clegane. The Hound said nothing, only shifted his weight. Finally, the robed man cleared his throat. "We suspect this chest might have once belonged to King Robert Baratheon," he said. "Judging by the crest and some partial records we recovered, the chest was stored away after Robert's rebellion." King Robert's name hung in the air. Gendry tried to look impassive, but the mention stirred something in him. He had never known the man personally, yet he had heard rumors all his life that he might be one of Robert's many bastards. The possibility had always felt like an idle tale. A small flame of curiosity flickered inside him now. "Very well," Gendry said, his voice neutral. "But what's that to do with me?" The robed man exhaled, then tugged the lid of the chest open. Creaked, protesting years of neglect. Inside, Gendry saw a number of items. Scraps of cloth, old documents so brittle they looked ready to crumble. A large leather-bound ledger that might have been a hunting record, and something wrapped carefully in faded velvet. The robed man gingerly pulled out the velvet-wrapped object and set it on top of the chest. He unwrapped it to reveal a pendant of exquisite workmanship. A disc of black onyx, carved into the shape of a stag's head, crowned with 8 tines, each tipped with a chip of golden amber. The stag's eyes were inset with small chunks of jade. Etched around the circumference of the disc was a ring of runic script that Gendry couldn't read. "This is a pendant of House Baratheon from a time far older than Robert's rule," said the robed man. "We believe it may have belonged to Robert's grandfather, or perhaps even further back. The script is from the days of the Storm Kings, before the Targaryen conquest. Quite the relic." Gendry stared down at the thing, mesmerized. It was beautiful in a rugged, ancient way, and the stag's proud face seemed almost alive in the glow of the torch. Why had they brought him here? Did they merely want him to appraise it? He was a blacksmith's apprentice, not a scholar of heirlooms. The robed man cleared his throat again, as if searching for the right words. "We discovered something else in the chest," he said. Correspondence that suggests this relic was passed down along Baratheon lines for generations. After Robert took the throne, he had it brought to the Red Keep. But soon after, it was lost in the shuffle, or so it seems. He dug around in the chest and produced a folded slip of parchment sealed with a spot of old wax. "Read it," he said, handing it to Gendry. Carefully, Gendry took the parchment and broke the seal. It felt wrong to be handling something that might have belonged to a king. He peered at the words scrawled in a bold but uneven script. The language was stiff and archaic. "I pass on this symbol of our blood, unbroken by the storms of centuries past. May the rightful Baratheon heir bear it, and may it guide him through the darkest nights. Let no bastard or pretender lay claim to it. It belongs to the blood of the stag and the stag alone." He read it through once, then again. When he lifted his eyes, the robed man was studying him. The corners of Sandor Clegane's mouth looked tight, as if he waited for a reaction. "Well?" the robed man asked. "What do you think?" Gendry felt a surge of unease. "I don't understand. Are you expecting me to?" "It's been suggested," the robed man began haltingly, "that King Robert intended this heirloom for a true Baratheon heir, his rightful child." The man's emphasis on rightful was not lost on Gendry. Outside the Red Keep's official declarations, there were widespread rumors that Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella were not Robert's children at all, but the products of an incestuous relationship between Queen Cersei and her twin brother, Jaime Lannister. For many, that was mere scandalous gossip, but more than a few believed it was truth. Gendry took a step back. He realized the Hound was watching him carefully, as though waiting to see if Gendry would do something foolish. "I'm no highborn lord," he said, fumbling for the right words. "I'm just a blacksmith's apprentice." The robed man nodded. "Indeed. Yet the crown has interests in ensuring that all of Robert's possessions are accounted for, especially any that might." He trailed off, then tried again. "That might hold significance for the rightful Baratheon line." Gendry forced a laugh, though there was no mirth in it. "You think I'm some rightful heir? That's madness." Sandor Clegane spoke for the first time, his rasping voice as rough as gravel. "Take it," he said, motioning to the pendant. His Grace the King commanded that any of Robert's personal effects be returned to the Baratheon line if possible. His Grace the King. But if Joffrey was not truly Robert's son, what then? Gendry's mind began to churn with all the rumors he had heard about Robert's many bastards. If Joffrey had no blood claim to the Baratheon name, then who did? Edric Storm was rumored to be in Storm's End, but that was distant news. Others said Maya Stone lived in the Vale, but Gendry only knew scattered pieces of gossip. Why would they come to him? He realized, with a hot spike of panic, that this might be a trap. If the rumors were indeed true that Joffrey was no Baratheon, then the Lannisters would be eager to snuff out any potential threat to the throne. Was that why the Hound loomed over him like a vulture? Gendry swallowed hard. "Take it," the Hound repeated. Gendry slowly reached out and lifted the pendant from the robed man's hand. Felt heavy, an unexpected weight for something so small. The black onyx was cold against his skin. He could feel a strange hum of significance coursing through him, like a chill in the bloodstream. "There," said the robed man. "It belongs to you now, by order of King Joffrey Baratheon." Gendry clenched his jaw. The king, if Joffrey was truly the king, had decided that an ancient Baratheon heirloom should belong to Gendry. He imagined Cersei's sneer if she learned about this. He pictured the frown on Lord Tywin's face. Was this some twisted way to parade Gendry around as a curiosity, or to keep him under watch? The robed man closed the chest. "We have no further need of you," he said. "You can take the pendant and leave. The crown recognizes it as a gift from the line of House Baratheon to one of Robert's descendants." The final word was spoken delicately, but there was no mistaking the implication. Descendant. Bastard or not, Gendry was in possession of an item that was explicitly meant for a trueborn Baratheon. He was too stunned to argue. Without further ado, the messenger who had first brought him to the Red Keep appeared again and gestured that Gendry should follow him back out to the courtyard. The Hound did not protest, So Gendry tucked the pendant into a pouch at his belt and walked away in a daze. Outside, the sky was still bright with mid-afternoon sun, but Gendry felt as though the world had shifted in a profound way. He could sense the weight of the onyx pendant like an anchor around his waist, a physical reminder that something about him, and his past, was bigger than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He slipped away from the Red Keep without a word. By evening, he was safe in the cramped room he slept in above Tobo Mott's forge. He took out the pendant and laid it in his palm, turning it over and over in the low candlelight. The stag's head caught the flicker of the flame, and the amber tips on the antlers shimmered. On impulse, he slipped it around his neck. It settled against his chest, cold and unyielding. Days passed. Gendry continued working the forge as usual, but a new tension filled the air of King's Landing. Whispers in the street said that King Joffrey had learned of a special gift bestowed on a Baratheon bastard. Others claimed that the Lannisters were growing uneasy, that the legitimacy of Joffrey's reign had yet another potential threat, an heirloom that signaled Gendry's true parentage. But no one took open action against him. Perhaps it was just not the right moment. War loomed, and the royals had bigger concerns than a lowly bastard. Yet the city was alive with rumor. Word spread that a certain blacksmith's apprentice had found proof of his lineage. The gold cloaks started keeping a careful watch on Gendry whenever he ventured beyond the Street of Steel. One day, while purchasing bread in the market, he noticed two men in the cloaks of the city watch following him at a distance. When he caught them looking, they turned away as if nothing was amiss. It set his nerves on edge. Gendry tried to push his worries aside. After all, he had no intention of claiming the Iron Throne. He wasn't foolish enough to fancy that. He had spent his life around men who forged real steel with their hands, not illusions of grandeur. It was enough that he had a stable life, enough coin for bread, and a roof above his head. Let the lords and ladies play their games. But fate does not bend so easily to one's preferences. One afternoon, a group of gold cloaks arrived at the smithy. Their captain was a tall man with a thick mustache, and he asked to see Gendry in private. Tobo Mott gave a nervous nod and ushered them into a side workshop. "You're Gendry, yes?" asked the captain, eyeing him. "We have instructions to take you to the Red Keep for questioning." Gendry's palms began to sweat. "Questioning about what?" The captain shrugged, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Orders from the hand of the king, Lord Tywin Lannister. Best to come quietly, lad." The mention of Lord Tywin's name weighed heavily. Gendry swallowed. He knew if the hand of the king was involved, refusing would be a grave mistake. He nodded, letting them lead him out of the smithy. The old scowl on Tobo Mott's face told Gendry that his master was far from pleased, but neither of them had much choice. They walked the winding streets back up toward the Red Keep. Gendry could hardly ignore the stares from bystanders. Whispers trailed after him like ghosts. The captain led him inside and down a corridor that Gendry recognized from his last visit. But this time they turned into a different passage. They climbed stairs, passing rows of tall windows, until they reached a spacious solar whose windows overlooked the Blackwater rush below. To Gendry's surprise, it was not Lord Tywin who waited for him, but Queen Cersei herself. She stood by one of the arched windows, her green eyes narrowed to slits. She wore a gown of crimson silk, trimmed with gold. On a nearby table, a silver pitcher of wine and 2 cups had been prepared. No other courtiers were present, only 2 Lannister guards flanking the door. "Leave us," she commanded the gold cloaks, and they filed out. The door shut with a dull thud. Gendry made a half-bow, uncertain of protocol. The queen's gaze flicked from his head down to his boots and back again. A slow, icy smile curled across her lips. "So you're the blacksmith's apprentice," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Not very kingly, are you?" "I'm no king, your grace," Gendry answered carefully, keeping his head lowered. "I'm just a bastard who works the forge." She studied him a moment. "And yet you bear a certain trinket that belonged to House Baratheon." She spoke the word trinket with a tone of disdain. "I want to see it." Gendry's chest tightened. He reached beneath his tunic and drew out the pendant, letting it rest on the outside of his clothing. The stag's head gleamed under the midday sun streaming through the window. Cersei's lips tightened. So it's true. One of my late husband's family heirlooms ended up around the neck of some random urchin. She stepped closer, one hand extended as if she wanted to touch the pendant, but at the last second she recoiled. Lord Tywin was of a mind to have you thrown into the dungeon for your audacity in wearing the Baratheon sigil. But I suggested a different approach. Gendry stood rigid, unsure what to say. Silence seemed safest. The queen circled him slowly, her eyes calculating. We could have you killed and claim the pendant was stolen. But such a sloppy act might fuel the rumors that my son Joffrey is not Robert's trueborn heir. That's the last thing we need, especially with Stannis and Renly at each other's throats, each calling himself a king. He could hear the venom in her voice as she spoke of Robert's brothers. Indeed, from what Gendry knew, Renly had crowned himself in Highgarden's rose-strewn courts, while Cersei stopped in front of him and folded her arms. "So here's what I propose, boy," she said. "You will remain under the crown's protection. You will be quartered here in the castle, or close to it, as a sign of the king's goodwill toward all of Robert's brood." Her emphasis on brood dripped with contempt. "If you refuse, you'll likely not survive the month. The city is a dangerous place for one wearing such an object, especially when lesser minds might start seeing you as a figurehead to rally around." Gendry's instincts screamed that it was a trap. She was basically offering him captivity masquerading as protection. And yet, what choice did he have? He needed time to think, to plan his next move. He could almost feel the subtle terror of her presence pressing down on him, forcing him to comply. At length he nodded. "Good," she said coolly. "I'll have the steward set aside rooms for you in Maegor's Holdfast. You'll remain there when you're not in the forge. You'll continue your work under the crown's commission, forging arms and armor for the gold cloaks. In return, you will not speak to anyone about your parentage. You will not mention that pendant to a living soul, beyond what they might already suspect. If you break these rules, you'll regret it." Gendry bit the inside of his cheek. "I understand, Your Grace." A long silence passed. Then Cersei took her seat near the table and casually poured herself a cup of wine. "We shall see," she said, half to herself. Dismissed. He left with his head spinning. That same day, the steward assigned him a modest chamber in Maegor's Holdfast, near the kitchens. The room was small and sparse, but it was leagues above what Gendry was used to in the forge. A single window overlooked the castle yard. It felt more like a cell than a courtesy, but Gendry told himself that staying alive was better than foolish heroics. And so a strange routine began. By day, Gendry labored in one of the Red Keep's private workshops, forging arms for the gold cloaks and occasionally for the Kingsguard. Though the master armorer remained Tobomot, Gendry now found himself receiving direct orders from castle officials, some in Lannister livery. The men treated him with cautious politeness, as if uncertain whether to scorn him for being a bastard or fear him for the rumors of his significance. By night, he retired to his chamber, accompanied by 2 guards who waited just outside his door. He soon learned that King Joffrey was ignoring him, as if refusing to acknowledge his existence. The king had not summoned Gendry for any audiences, nor spoken to him in the halls. Yet Gendry felt the undercurrent of tension grow stronger every day. The court was fracturing under the stress of the war. Supplies were short. Word had come that Renly Baratheon was slain, some said by dark magic, leaving the Tyrells in uneasy alliance with the Lannisters. Meanwhile, Stannis was marching on King's Landing itself. In that chaos, Gendry's presence became a pawn in the Lannisters' eyes. As the city prepared for siege, many of the lesser lords and knights loyal to the memory of Robert Baratheon began to murmur about Joffrey's legitimacy. Some of those whispers inevitably circled back to Gendry. It was said that he bore a far stronger resemblance to the late king than Joffrey ever had. Some in the Red Keep, fearful of Tywin's wrath, said nothing of it openly, but Gendry could see it in their furtive looks. The day of Stannis' approach came at last, under the blazing sun. The city gates were barred. The small folk scurried in terror, trying to hide from the looming threat of the Baratheon host outside the walls. The golden lions of House Lannister snapped in the wind over the battlements. Gendry worked the forge feverishly, forging arrowheads and spear points. Men were dying all around the city walls, and the strong, acrid smell of wildfire drifted in the air. Cersei's pyromancers had apparently prepared a deadly stockpile, unleashing green flames upon Stannis' fleet on the Blackwater. Gendry heard the roar of the wildfire blasts echo through the city. The ground seemed to shake. He kept hammering, trying to shut out the thought that men outside these walls were fighting and dying, convinced they were doing their duty for a rightful king. Which king that might be, Gendry could no longer say. Joffrey was still enthroned in the Red Keep, but Stannis was also a Baratheon by blood, and Gendry himself was caught in the swirl of their claims. When the night was over, King Joffrey's forces had won a brutal victory. Stannis' army retreated in disarray. Fire still clung to the wreckage in the Blackwater rush. The city rejoiced in a savage, desperate way, though many had died. In the courtyard, Gendry saw men covered in burns, moaning on stretchers. Tyrion Lannister was said to have been gravely wounded defending the Mud Gate. The Tyrells arrived in force shortly thereafter, bringing fresh supplies and alliance. A massive Tyrell Lannister wedding was hastily arranged. Joffrey to wed Margaery Tyrell. The relief among the city's defenders was palpable. It was not long after that victory feast, where Gendry remained an uninvited shadow, forging replacements for all the arms lost in battle, that the next major shift occurred. The rumors about Joffrey's parentage flared up again, somehow more potent than ever. Great lords who had joined the Lannisters for the war's sake began to ask questions. Many had known Robert well, and they recognized none of his qualities in Joffrey. More worrisome still, many had heard about the ancient Baratheon pendant that the queen had effectively bestowed on a bastard boy. It was one thing to hush up a rumor. It was another to explain why an artifact so clearly tied to Baratheon lineage was being worn by a bastard who, by all accounts, had Robert's coloring and stature. It came to a head one morning, when a group of lords loyal to House Tyrell, along with a handful of Crownland bannermen who had served Robert, demanded an audience in the throne room. Gendry's presence was ordered, as well. Perhaps Cersei believed that having Gendry stand there as a menial servant would quell the rumors, showing him to be a docile bastard under control. Instead, it served as a catalyst for chaos. The throne room was glittering in the midday sun. King Joffrey perched on the Iron Throne, wearing robes of crimson and gold, a sneer on his lips. By his side stood Queen Cersei and Lord Tywin, as cold and imposing as a statue of stone. The High Lords who demanded audience bowed stiffly. An older lord spoke first. "Your Grace, we come to address a matter of concern," he said, carefully choosing his words. "A matter of your lineage. Rumors persist that you are not truly of Baratheon blood." At once, muttering erupted in the chamber. Cersei's face blazed with fury, but she held her composure, eyes darting to Lord Tywin for support. Joffrey himself rose halfway out of the throne in anger. "How dare you?" Joffrey spat. "I'll have your tongues for this slander." But the older lord pressed on, emboldened by the presence of others. "We mean no disrespect, Your Grace, but with the war raging, your subjects need certainty. They need to see proof that you are indeed Robert Baratheon's trueborn son, particularly when there is another who—" He trailed off, glancing toward Gendry, who stood uncomfortably off to the side, the Baratheon pendant visible against his black tunic. The hush that fell across the throne room was absolute. It was as though every soul present held their breath. Joffrey's gaze snapped to Gendry. A flicker of something like hate and fear danced in the boy king's eyes. "Guards!" he snapped. "Seize him!" A wave of gold cloaks surged forward, grabbing Gendry roughly, though they had been half expecting the order. For a moment, Gendry's old instincts flared. He contemplated fighting back, but the memory of his place here, and the dozens of guards present, stayed his hand. He was forced to his knees, arms pinned behind his back. Cersei stepped forward, her voice cold and resonant. "Yes, this bastard has no right to wear House Baratheon's sigil or heirloom. He is no one. The older lord who had spoken mustered his courage. "Your grace, if he is no one, then let the matter be addressed. If he is truly a mere blacksmith, then let it be shown. But if—" "Silence!" The shriek came from Joffrey. The boy king's face was red, eyes bulging with anger. "I am the king, and I will not hear more of this. This is my father's throne. Guards, throw him in the dungeons. Let him rot there." Gendry felt the hands on him tighten, and dread gripped his heart. Would this be the end? A swift, quiet disappearance? It was Lord Tywin who intervened in a calm, commanding tone. "Your Grace, perhaps it would be wiser to handle this matter with discretion. The lords merely seek an assurance of your lineage. Having the boy vanish might only spur more rumors." Tywin's cold green eyes rested momentarily on Gendry. "We can secure a more final resolution with physical proof. Attest, if you will." Queen Cersei's mouth twitched in unease, but Joffrey, still enraged, shot back. "What sort of test?" "A careful comparison of the bloodlines, possibly the verifying of old genealogical records, the knowledge of the maesters," Tywin said. "In the meantime, keep him imprisoned but alive. Dead men cannot quell rumors, they only stoke them." Joffrey's knuckles whitened as he gripped the metal arm of the throne. He glanced at Cersei. She gave a slight nod, her face drained of expression. The king inhaled sharply through his nose, as though restraining himself. "Fine," he bit out. "Do as my grandfather says. Lock this bastard up in the darkest cell. Let him taste bread and water until we can prove once and for all that I am the rightful king." The guards forced Gendry to his feet, dragging him backward, his feet scrabbling on the polished floor. He could hear the gasps and murmurs from the gathered lords. Queen Cersei's gaze followed him, icy and triumphant. Lord Tywin kept his face impassive, already calculating how to manipulate this fiasco. Joffrey glared, chest heaving with fury. Outside the throne room, Gendry was hustled down several flights of stairs into the bowels of the Red Keep. The darkness swallowed him. The guards did not speak. They shoved him into a cramped cell lit by a single torch in the hallway beyond. He landed on the stone floor with a grunt as the heavy iron door slammed shut. He lay there, breathing heavily, his wrists aching where the guards had gripped them, and listened to the receding footsteps. He could still feel the pendant under his tunic, a constant reminder of the cause of all this trouble. Fear curled in his stomach. Cersei and Joffrey would not hesitate to kill him if they deemed it convenient. Tywin might be the only thing staying their hands. But for how long? The cell was damp, reeking of mildew and rot. A sliver of torchlight through the door's grate was his only illumination. Hours passed. He tried to focus his thoughts to figure out a way to survive. He had never wanted to claim a throne. He only wanted to be a blacksmith. But this was bigger than him now. The rumors had taken on a life of their own. Lords and knights saw him as a rallying point. Perhaps the realm itself was desperate for any hope of a stable Baratheon monarchy. That gave him a flicker of uneasy realization. Joffrey's tyranny had angered many. If these men believed Gendry was a more rightful heir, they might do anything to get him out of the Lannisters' grasp. He dozed fitfully, unsure how much time passed. Eventually, a clang startled him awake. The cell door swung open. To his shock, the hound stood there, holding a torch. Behind him loomed 2 gold cloaks. Sandor Clegane's face was twisted in annoyance. He beckoned, and the guards stepped inside. One clamped a hand around Gendry's upper arm, hauling him to his feet. "Up with you, bastard," the hound growled. "The hand wants a word." Gendry's heart hammered. He stumbled out into the corridor, escorted by the guards. The hound said nothing more, just led them down twisting hallways until they reached a small, windowless chamber. Gendry was pushed inside. Lord Tywin was there, dressed in a severe black doublet trimmed in gold, a single candle on the table casting flickering shadows on his face. His eyes, cold as chips of green ice, locked onto Gendry. The hound stationed himself at the door. Tywin spoke without preamble. "Sit," he said, gesturing at a wooden stool in front of the table. Gendry obeyed, wincing at the bruises on his arms. Tywin's voice was calm, but the tension beneath was unmistakable. "You've become a problem, boy, whether you intended to or not." Gendry swallowed, nodding weakly. "I never asked for any of this." "Of course you didn't, but you wear Robert's face, and now you bear this heirloom. The lords see it as a sign." Tywin steepled his fingers. "And we cannot allow them to undermine King Joffrey." Gendry tried to keep his tone steady. "Then kill me if that's what you mean to do. Stop playing games." Tywin's expression didn't flicker. "A corpse can be dangerous. Martyrs rally more support than living figureheads in some cases. Already the city is whispering that Joffrey is not Robert's son. But you are. If we kill you, that rumor grows stronger. We need a more elegant solution." Gendry stared back at the man. "What do you propose?" Tywin gave him a thin smile. "Convince the realm you are not Robert's son, that the pendant was a mistaken gift, that there is no Baratheon blood in your veins. If you do that, and do it convincingly, perhaps the realm will quiet. In return, I can ensure you leave King's Landing alive and well, with coin enough to start anew somewhere far from here." Gendry couldn't help a bitter laugh. "You think the realm will just believe me if I suddenly say I'm not Robert's bastard?" "They might," Tywin said coolly. "If we produce genealogical records that say your mother was from some low-born family in Lannisport, or fabricate the necessary evidence, I can make it convincing. People will believe what benefits them to believe, especially if the alternative is an all-out war over succession." Gendry was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of it settle in. Tywin was offering him a way out, but it meant denying who he was. He had never truly known Robert, never considered himself a prince. And yet, part of him rankled at the idea of lying so thoroughly. Something about it felt hollow, like he would be handing the realm over to a pretender and possibly letting the people suffer Joffrey's tyranny. But if Gendry refused, he would die, or become a puppet in someone else's rebellion. He was not sure which was worse. Tywin read the conflict in Gendry's eyes. "Think carefully, boy. You owe the realm nothing. You owe Robert nothing. He never acknowledged you. You've no ties to the wolves or the other Baratheons, so far as I'm aware. This is the best offer you'll get." The candle flickered, casting shadows across Tywin's gaunt face. Gendry's mind spun. He could take Tywin's deal and walk away, or refuse and face near-certain doom. Or was there a third path? Could he leverage the rebellious feelings in the city to overthrow Joffrey? That seemed preposterous. He was only a bastard boy, uneducated in politics or warfare. The memory of the lords in the throne room, demanding proof, burned in his mind. Perhaps they would help him. But even if they did, it would lead to more bloodshed. The Lannisters wouldn't simply surrender. War would come again, and thousands might die just to seat Gendry on the Iron Throne. The thought made him recoil. He had never wanted to be a king. Yet, the cruelty of Joffrey and Cersei, the arrogance of Tywin, was also evident. Could Gendry in good conscience abandon the city to their rule, especially with the knowledge that Joffrey had no right to the throne? Perhaps Robert's rightful heir was Stannis, but he had been driven back at Blackwater, and few outside Dragonstone still championed him. Tommen was yet another rumored Lannister bastard. This could go on forever, swirling in Gendry's head, if he did not make a decision. "I'll think about your offer," Gendry said at last. "You'll do more than think," Tywin said, rising from his seat. "Give me your answer by dawn. One of my men will come for you then." He motioned to the hound, who seized Gendry's arm. "Take him back to his cell." As he was led away, Gendry turned Tywin's words over in his mind. The callousness of it all disgusted him, yet he could not deny the practicality of Tywin's plan. The man had shaped wars and toppled houses with that same dispassionate logic. Back in his cell, Gendry brooded. He reached inside his tunic and pulled out the pendant, peering at the carved stag's head. Would refusing Tywin's offer be worth the slaughter that might follow? Should he consign all these people to more bloodshed, or watch them suffer under Joffrey? Gendry felt a wave of exhaustion. He was a blacksmith's apprentice thrust into a game of kings. Hours passed. He dozed off. When he woke, he was startled by the sound of the cell door opening. He expected Tywin's men, but instead, the figure entering the cell was the last person he imagined, Arya Stark. He recognized her instantly despite her changed appearance. She had grown a bit taller since he last saw her on the road. Those few chaotic days after he had left Tobo Mott's forge, before the gold cloaks had come hunting Robert's bastards. But that was a lifetime ago in another version of events. They had been separated, and Gendry had ended up returning to the city, coerced by threats, while Arya had vanished into the war-torn Riverlands. Now she stood there, dressed in rough-spun breeches and a patched shirt. Her hair was cropped short like a boy's, and a dagger was clenched in her hand. The guard behind her lay slumped in the corridor, unconscious or dead. Gendry couldn't tell. "Arya?" he breathed. She stared at him wide-eyed, as though still in shock that she had managed to sneak this far. "We don't have much time," she hissed, stepping fully into the cell. "Are you hurt?" He pushed himself upright. "I'm fine. But what are you? How did you get here?" "Stories later," she said, brandishing the dagger. "I had help from some friends. We're getting you out of here." Gendry's mind reeled. If she was caught, the Lannisters would kill her. But from the look in her eyes, Arya would not be dissuaded. She stepped over to him, scanning for shackles or manacles, but he was unbound. "Come on." He rose and followed her into the corridor. The fallen guard was still breathing. The man had only been knocked out, though Arya's dagger had a smear of blood. Perhaps there had been a struggle. Quietly, they slipped down the passage. Gendry's pulse thundered. He kept waiting for an alarm to sound. The Red Keep was not easily infiltrated. And yet, they went unchallenged through the twisting underbelly, guided by Arya's silent urgency. She led him to a concealed postern door that opened onto a steep flight of stairs. They emerged in the cool night air, behind one of the stables. A hooded figure stood there, beckoning. Arya passed Gendry to the figure, who turned out to be none other than Yoren's friend, an ex-brother of the Night's Watch who had once recognized Gendry as a likely bastard. Gendry didn't recall his name, but he recognized the worn black cloak. No time for pleasantries. The hooded man led them to a pair of horses. Arya mounted one, Gendry the other, and they spurred the animals into motion, slipping away from the Red Keep's perimeter. The city was large and chaotic, but at this time of night, they could pass through side streets with minimal attention. Even so, Gendry expected at any moment to hear horns or the pounding of gold cloaks behind them. They reached a small postern gate in the city walls. Another bribe or two from the hooded man, another quiet threat with Arya's dagger, and the guards let them pass. Gendry could scarcely believe it. They were free of King's Landing. He looked back one last time at the walls and towers, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and wondered if Tywin would realize by dawn that Gendry had fled. They rode through the night, away from the city's glow. Arya eventually explained how she had ended up traveling with a band of outlaws, Beric Dondarrion and the Brotherhood Without Banners, who championed the small folk and fought against Lannister oppression. Word had reached them about Gendry's predicament. Arya, upon discovering that Gendry was in the Red Keep's dungeons, had demanded they try to free him. The Brotherhood had planned to smuggle him out, hoping he might help their cause by rallying the common people. But chaos in the city had delayed their plan. At last, Arya took it into her own hands, slipping into the Red Keep with a bit of inside help from a spy among the servants. Though the plan was half-formed and risky, it had succeeded, at least for now. "Thank you," Gendry whispered when they finally halted to rest at dawn, well outside the city's reach. He was bone-weary, his entire body taut with nerves and exhaustion. Arya shrugged, though she looked relieved. "You helped me once," she said, "and I couldn't just let them kill you or use you as a puppet. You're my friend." He managed a tired smile. He said, and felt a warmth in his chest despite everything. They pressed onward, heading southwest along the Blackwater, keeping off the main roads to avoid Lannister patrols. At times, they had to pick their way through battered villages or slip around small groups of soldiers. The war had left the Crownlands ravaged in places, but they managed to avoid the worst of it. At every tavern or holdfast, Gendry heard the rumors about King's Landing. The Tyrells were now firmly in alliance with the Lannisters, and King Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell was still on track. Lord Tywin held the city in a firm grip. Word of Gendry's disappearance was swirling, fueling more rumors. Some claimed he had been smuggled away by a secret faction of knights loyal to Robert's memory. Others said Varys, the spider, had spirited him out to sow chaos. Regardless, the talk was that Joffrey's legitimacy was in question again, especially after he tried to have Gendry executed in front of the lords. They called Joffrey a usurper in taverns late at night, careful to keep voices low. Gendry listened, uneasy at the role he played in all this. Yet their journey was not aimless. After a week of slow progress, avoiding soldiers, Gendry and Arya were met by a small scouting party from the Brotherhood without banners. It was led by a tall man with a patch over one eye, Lord Beric Dondarrion himself. With him was Thuras of Myr, the Red Priest, his ruby amulet glinting at his throat. They greeted Arya warmly, though Beric's attention quickly shifted to Gendry. "You must be the one," he said, studying Gendry's face by firelight. "The rumored Baratheon bastard with the old stag pendant." Gendry nodded, unslinging the pendant from under his cloak so Beric could see. It felt strange to display it as though it were some sign of his worth. The one-eyed lord nodded thoughtfully. "You do look like Robert in his youth," he observed, half a smile on his lips. "I knew him back when he was still Lord of the Stormlands. He was my liege lord. You have his jaw and his strength, no doubt. If half the tales are true, you might have his appetite for feasts and battles too." The conversation turned serious as Thuras explained their situation. The Brotherhood fought to protect the common folk from the depredations of warring lords. Now that Gendry was free, there was talk among the Brotherhood that he could be a powerful symbol, someone to rally behind as an alternative to the Lannisters. Yet Beric and Thuras were hesitant. After all, the Brotherhood recognized King Robert's brother Stannis as the rightful heir under the law, if not in popularity. But Stannis had lost at Blackwater, and his cause seemed dim. Some of the outlaws believed Gendry might unite the battered lords under the true Baratheon line. Others believed that would only lead to more war and strife. Beric addressed Gendry directly, speaking earnestly. "We fight for the small folk, not for kings or crowns. But the Lannisters are a plague upon the realm. If you were to reveal yourself and your claim, gather those who despise the Lannisters, you might succeed in toppling Joffrey. The realm might rally behind you." Gendry looked into the dancing flames of the campfire. "I'm no king," he said again, weary. "I can't offer them the cunning of Lord Tywin, the wealth of Highgarden, or the armies of the Reach. I can barely read. How am I supposed to lead an entire realm?" Beric nodded, understanding. "I once believed King Robert would be a fair ruler, for he was well loved by many. But ruling is harder than winning a crown. If you seek to claim your birthright, you must be ready for all the consequences." Arya, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "What if you don't do it for power, Gendry? What if you do it to save the people from Joffrey and Cersei? You saw what they did to my father." Her voice wavered slightly. "If they remain on the throne, so many more will suffer." Those words sank into Gendry like hot coals. He remembered Ned Stark's execution in the Great September, how it had shocked the realm. Joffrey's cruelty was legendary. The notion of letting them continue to rule unchecked was horrifying. Beric added quietly, "There are lords who served under Robert who would throw their banners to you in an instant if they had proof. Something more than rumor. That heirloom around your neck, the living memory of Robert's face, might just be enough. And if you had the right alliances." Gendry exhaled, feeling the weight of the stag pendant as if it were an anvil on his chest. "I can't claim something I don't understand," he said, but the seed was planted. The conversation turned to logistics. Beric proposed that the Brotherhood discreetly spread word of Gendry's rescue among sympathetic lords, to gauge interest. They could arrange a secret gathering, a council of sorts, where Gendry could present himself, show the pendant, and let these lords decide if they would support him. In the days that followed, The Brotherhood orchestrated quiet messages to various bannermen of the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and even some of the Reach. They hinted that a hidden Baratheon heir was prepared to stand against Joffrey. Gendry mostly kept to the outlaws' camps, forging arrowheads and swords from whatever scraps of steel they could salvage. He found comfort in the familiar clang of metal, though his future weighed heavily on his mind. Arya hovered nearby, sometimes practicing swordplay with the orphans and outlaws, always checking on Gendry to see how he fared. At last, messages returned. A handful of lords, knights, and lesser nobles agreed to meet in a ruined holdfast deep in the Riverlands. The location was chosen for its secrecy, hidden among dense forests far from prying eyes. And so, one cold morning, Gendry, Arya, Beric, and Thuras traveled there, escorted by a small contingent of Brotherhood fighters. They arrived at twilight. Torches illuminated a half-collapsed great hall. Around a rough-hewn table sat men Gendry had never seen before, lords in travel-stained cloaks, knights with battered armor. Their sigils were scattered. A leaping trout of Riverrun, a few nameless lesser houses. A stout man with a faded banner showing a lightning bolt. A lanky knight wearing the insignia of House Dondarrion, Beric's own. They were not many, and none seemed especially powerful on their own, but collectively they might stand for something if they could rally larger houses. Beric introduced Gendry, calling him son of Robert Baratheon. The men leaned in, eyes aflame with curiosity and hope. Gendry's mouth felt dry. He displayed the pendant, letting them see the ancient script and the stag head etched in onyx. Several recognized the antique craft of it, murmuring in awe. More than one nodded, as though it confirmed everything they had heard. When Gendry spoke, he kept it simple. He told them he was a blacksmith's apprentice who never knew his father. He had no grand illusions of being a king, but he wanted to see a just ruler on the throne. He hated Joffrey for his cruelty, for the blood spilled senselessly. If the realm truly wanted him as a rallying symbol to cast down the false king, then he would not shrink from that responsibility. But he would not pretend to be something he was not. He was a bastard. If they expected a polished courtier, they would be disappointed. The men exchanged glances. A short knight with a bushy beard spoke up. "Lad, I served King Robert in the rebellion against the Mad King. I stood with him when he crushed Rhaegar's chest with his warhammer on the trident. It was the proudest moment of my life, thinking we'd placed a just man on the throne. But later, I saw how his rule decayed, how the Lannisters coiled around him like snakes. I will not let Robert's memory be stained by that inbred whelp Joffrey. If you are his blood, you have a right to stand against them. I'll follow you." One by one, the others voiced varying degrees of support, or at least cautious optimism. They saw Gendry's existence as a chance to unify those disgusted by Lannister rule. The greatest difficulty would be marshalling enough power to challenge the combined might of the Lannisters and Tyrells. But perhaps other houses, stung by the Lannisters' arrogance, would flock to a new Baratheon standard, especially if they believed Gendry had a rightful claim. Beric Dondarrion ended the meeting with a solemn vow to gather more allies. Plans were laid to create a new banner for Gendry, a blacksmith's hammer behind a crowned stag, a symbol of the bastard who had once been a blacksmith's apprentice. They would not rush into open war. Instead, they would spread the word and gather men in secret. If enough houses rose in rebellion, the Lannisters might be forced to retreat or compromise. Perhaps even the Tyrells might abandon Joffrey if they saw his cause as hopeless. Gendry felt a tumult of emotions as the men left. He was frightened, thrilled, uneasy, and resolved all at once. Arya grinned at him, but behind her smile lay an undercurrent of sadness or worry. They both knew how dangerous this was. Still, for her father, for her family's suffering, Arya supported any cause that would topple the Lannisters. Over the following weeks, rumors blossomed across the Riverlands and beyond. Tales of the blacksmith king circulated. Some laughed at the notion, but others found hope in it. The Lannisters caught wind of the new threat, of course, and they dispatched more patrols to hunt for outlaws. Tywin was rumored to be furious, Joffrey even more so. The king had apparently raged in court, demanding Gendry's head. Small skirmishes erupted. The Brotherhood, along with the newly emboldened Loyalists, ambushed Lannister foraging parties. They burned supply wagons, freed prisoners, and displayed the crowned stag on black banners, with a smith's hammer in the background. Some villagers cheered them. Others looked on in fear, uncertain if the Lannisters would burn them in reprisal. As the months passed, Gendry found himself leading a small but growing contingent of men. He tried to stay humble, forging weapons alongside them, listening to their stories. He donned half-plate armor hammered by his own hand, bearing the new sigil. Arya often rode beside him, though she had her own yearnings, to find her family, to avenge their losses. She stayed because she believed in him, or perhaps just to see the Lannisters fall. The Crown's forces under Tywin reacted with brutal efficiency, stamping out rebellious houses or ravaging villages suspected of supporting Gendry. Yet the more they crushed, the stronger the defiance grew. House Tully, battered though it was, quietly funneled supplies. Other houses sent men in secret. Raventree Hall, White Walls, even some knights from the Stormlands who had grown disenchanted with Stannis' fanaticism. Gendry's host was small compared to the Lannister-Tyrell alliance, but it was not insignificant. Every week, more trickled in, drawn by rumors of Robert's living blood and the ancient stag heirloom that signified a rightful claim. Eventually, the realm reached a tipping point. King Joffrey's tyranny, combined with the suspicion of his illegitimacy, caused even some of the Tyrells to question their betrothal alliance. Margaery Tyrell was said to be clever. She might have recognized that Joffrey was unstable and dangerous. Fissures formed in the alliance. Meanwhile, the Iron Bank of Bravos withheld loans from the crown, citing uncertain legitimacy. A subtle financial blow that forced Tywin to raise taxes even higher, enraging the small folk further. A cunning scheme took shape among the lords loyal to Gendry. They would quietly offer the Tyrells a chance to back Gendry instead, thus preserving House Tyrell's influence while discarding the toxic Lannister connection. It was a gamble, but the Tyrells had always been pragmatic. There was talk that the Tyrell matriarch, Lady Olenna, despised Joffrey's cruelty. If they convinced her that Gendry, the bastard heir of Robert, would be a more pliable and just king, she might switch sides. That would be the final blow. The Tyrell army was the main pillar holding up Joffrey, and so envoys were sent, whispers carried across the reach. No one knew how Lady Olenna would respond. Gendry, for his part, felt like a leaf in a storm, battered by forces beyond his control. He stayed with the Brotherhood in a hidden camp near the Trident, forging swords and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Arya tried to keep his spirits up with her dry humor, but the tension was immense. If the Tyrell alliance crumbled, King's Landing would be vulnerable. Joffrey's reign would be in peril. One cold dawn, a messenger arrived at the outlaws' camp, wearing the green and gold of Highgarden. He carried a sealed parchment, addressed to Lord Gendry Baratheon. The Brotherhood was stunned. The parchment bore the Tyrell rose in vibrant detail. Gendry opened it with trembling hands. The message was brief and oblique, but it invited Lord Gendry to attend a secret parley with representatives of House Tyrell near Bitterbridge. It seemed Lady Olenna wished to speak. Beric cautioned Gendry against a trap, but the young man's instincts told him that Lady Olenna had no reason to lure him into a simple ambush. If the Tyrells wanted him dead, the Lannisters had provided plenty of opportunities already. No, this was something else. A sign that the Tyrells might be ready to shift alliances. And so Gendry set off with a small escort, Arya at his side, and Beric as the voice of reason. They traveled inconspicuously, avoiding main roads, until they reached a modest hunting lodge near Bitterbridge. The banner of House Tyrell was raised discreetly, and in the courtyard, they found a handful of Tyrell men-at-arms. They were received politely, escorted into a small hall where Lady Olenna Tyrell awaited, along with Margaery Tyrell and a retinue of court ladies. Lady Olenna was famously sharp-tongued. She wasted no time in pleasantries. "So you're the blacksmith boy who calls himself Baratheon," she said by way of greeting. Her piercing eyes flicked to the pendant at Gendry's neck. "Charming trinket." Gendry bowed, struggling to keep his composure. "My lady," he said, and introduced himself awkwardly. Arya looked at Lady Olenna with open curiosity, while Beric gave a formal nod. Margaery Tyrell, slender and poised, studied Gendry from beneath long lashes. She smiled graciously, but with a hint of calculation in her gaze. "We've heard many stories about you, my lord. They say you have the late King Robert's strength." Gendry felt self-conscious. "I have a good swing with a hammer," he admitted. "But the realm needs more than strength." Lady Olenna snorted. "Indeed it does. It needs sense, decency, and a king who won't chop off tongues at the slightest provocation." Her words dripped with scorn for Joffrey. "Now, I won't prattle on. We Tyrells are in a precarious position. The Lannisters hold the capital, they have money, though that's dwindling thanks to that ridiculous war, and we've tied ourselves to them through a betrothal. But that betrothal can be broken if we see a more profitable alliance. If, for instance, a certain young man with Baratheon blood and a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne were to offer us a better arrangement." Gendry's throat tightened. Was she implying marriage? He cast a quick glance at Margaery. The young woman's serene face revealed nothing. Lady Olenna continued, "If we Tyrells break with the Lannisters, we will need to ensure we're backing a winner, not a limp donkey. How many men can you muster, boy? How many swords will rise for you?" Beric answered for Gendry. "Enough to give the Lannisters a fair fight, and more joining each day. The small folk hate them, especially after the way Joffrey's men have behaved. The Stormlands might come to Gendry if they see the Tyrells supporting his claim." Lady Olenna pursed her lips. "Humph. And do you intend to share power? Or become a great, unstoppable tyrant yourself once you have the throne?" Her stare bored into Gendry. He shook his head vehemently. "I have no interest in being a tyrant. I only want a just realm." She eyed him a moment longer, then shrugged, turning to Margaery. "Well, child, what do you think?" Margaery took a step forward, smiling softly. "I think we've all suffered under Joffrey's rule long enough. My grandmother has convinced me that the Lannisters are not the allies we hoped they'd be. Their debts, their cruelty, their disregard for the small folk. It's not what I want for the future of House Tyrell." Lady Olenna gave an approving nod, then looked back at Gendry. "So here's the proposition. We will announce that Margaery's betrothal to Joffrey is broken due to the crown's failure to meet certain obligations. Then we will declare support for the rightful Baratheon heir, meaning you. We bring our army to your side. You march on King's Landing. The realm sees a united front of Tyrell and Baratheon, just like in the days of Robert's rebellion. The city will likely surrender rather than face another sacking. Joffrey will be deposed, and you will be crowned. Do try not to bungle it." Gendry felt the blood drain from his face. He glanced at Arya, who looked equally startled. Lady Olenna was basically proposing that Margaery marry Gendry. That was the subtext, at least. He saw no other reason for the Tyrells to cast aside Joffrey and throw their might behind a bastard with a questionable claim, unless they sealed it by marriage. He swallowed. "My lady, that's a weighty matter. Marriage." Olenna waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I don't care if you wed my granddaughter or not, so long as the alliance is secure. But yes, typically these sorts of alliances are sealed with vows and heirs. Isn't that the game we're all forced to play?" Beric interjected. "My lord, the Tyrell host would ensure swift victory. The city would open its gates once they see the banners turned against the Lannisters." Arya scowled, but said nothing. Gendry gathered his courage. "If it means saving the realm from Joffrey, so be it. I accept." Margaery inclined her head graciously, though a tinge of regret or caution flickered in her eyes. "Then it's settled?" Lady Olenna smirked. "Settled for now. Let's see if this rebellious escapade actually works." That evening, the new alliance was formalized in hushed secrecy. Over the next few days, Tyrell banners began to march away from King's Landing under various excuses, protecting the Reach from bandits or reinforcing supply lines. In truth, they gathered at a staging point, ready to join Gendry's forces. The Lannisters, alarmed, demanded answers, but Lady Olenna and Marjorie deflected, stalling for time. Then, at the appointed moment, Marjorie publicly renounced her betrothal to Joffrey, citing the crown's mounting debts and the deterioration of the king's mental state. The Tyrell army raised a new banner, the Rose of Highgarden alongside the crowned stag of Baratheon, this time with Gendry's blacksmith hammer. Word spread like wildfire. King's Landing erupted into panic. Joffrey frothed at the mouth, threatening to have Marjorie's entire family beheaded. Cersei was rumored to be hysterical, calling for Gendry's immediate assassination. Lord Tywin scrambled to hold the city. Many of the Lannister bannermen wavered, reluctant to fight both the Tyrells and the swelling ranks of Gendry's supporters. Grand Maester Pycelle was said to have locked himself in his chambers to avoid the fallout. Gendry's combined host, Brotherhood outlaws, rebellious bannermen, and Tyrell forces, marched on King's Landing. It was an odd coalition. The stark green and gold Tyrell banners fluttered beside the makeshift black cloth bearing Gendry's stag and hammer. Commoners flocked to them, drawn by the promise of freedom from Lannister tyranny. As the army approached the capital, the gold and crimson banners upon the battlements seemed less imposing. Already, some of the city watch had quietly left their posts, or signaled that they would open the gates if the assault came. Tywin's gold was losing its power to buy loyalty in the face of near-certain defeat. A tense standoff ensued outside the city. Gendry remembered his last time standing near these walls, forging arms for the men who now stood against him. The final impetus came when a portion of the city watch turned cloak, opening a postern gate to allow a small vanguard of Tyrell knights to enter. A brief flurry of fighting broke out, but it was short-lived. The Lannister hold on the city crumbled from within, undone by fear and betrayal. Within a day, the city's gates were flung wide, and Gendry's forces entered triumphantly. The small folk lined the streets, cheering or gawking in amazement. They saw the rose and the stag in unison, and they saw the tall black-haired figure who bore the look of Robert Baratheon in his youth, though he was far more reserved. Gendry was in a daze, hardly believing it. The Red Keep was seized. Tywin Lannister, ever the realist, had already fled the city with a handful of loyal men. Cersei and Joffrey barricaded themselves in Maegor's holdfast, but even that holdout fell after some hours. Joffrey was dragged before the assembled lords, screaming curses and threats. With the city effectively in the hands of the new alliance, it was done. The false king had been deposed. Gendry, reluctant as he was, found himself facing the outcry for Joffrey's execution. Many demanded the boy king's head, calling it justice for all his cruelty. Others advised mercy, suggesting he be sent to the wall or exiled. Gendry, thinking of Ned Stark's memory and the thousands who had suffered, hesitated. In the end, the decision was taken from him. Marjorie Tyrell's father, Mace Tyrell, insisted that Joffrey pay for Ned Stark's murder and all his crimes. King or not, the realm thirsted for justice. Hours later, the headsman's sword fell. Joffrey died howling for his mother. Cersei's fate was left to Gendry's discretion. Feeling pity and recalling the warnings of vengeance, he opted to send her to a distant convent at the faith's urging, effectively removing her from the game. A broken shell of her former self, she spat curses at Gendry, calling him a usurping bastard as she was dragged away. As for Gendry, a hurried coronation was prepared. The High Septon, who had wavered in fear of the Lannisters, now placed a crown of black steel and gold upon Gendry's head. The small folk roared their approval, hailing him as Gendry of House Baratheon, the blacksmith king, first of his name, rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. His youth and inexperience worried many, but the presence of the Tyrell alliance helped steady the realm. The wedding to Marjorie was planned, though Gendry still felt uneasy about the politics behind it. Yet Marjorie reassured him that they could build a stable kingdom together, forging a new path that cared for the people. Arya stood by Gendry's side at the coronation, a mixture of pride and sorrow in her eyes. She could not help but think of her father, mother, and brothers, some dead, some missing. She was not sure if this new king and queen would restore her family's fortunes, but she found some solace in seeing the Lannisters brought low, and she knew Gendry's heart was good. When the crown touched Gendry's dark curls, he remembered the first time he had hammered iron in Tobo Mott's shop, how the sparks flew. His entire life had been shaped by that forge, by the sweat of honest work. Now an iron throne awaited him. The onyx pendant glinted on his chest, the proud stag a silent witness to the boy who never asked to be a king. As the hall thundered with acclamation, Gendry swore to himself he would rule with a smith's sense of justice and creation, not a tyrant's lust for power. He would do better than Robert, better than Joffrey, or die trying. And so began the reign of the blacksmith king, Gendry Baratheon, who had found an ancient heirloom proving his blood, and toppled a false tyrant in the process. Gendry had always pictured a coronation as a grand affair of polished marble floors, silken banners, and a multitude of lords and ladies decked in their finest. He thought of it as something far removed from himself, an event reserved for princes raised from the cradle on talk of duty and destiny. Instead, his own coronation at the Red Keep unfolded in a swirl of tension and relief, victory and mourning all in one. He stood at the end of the great hall, cloaked in dark velvet sewn with the new sigil, the crowned stag of Baratheon stamped over a crossed blacksmith's hammer. He still felt like a stranger in those rich garments. While the high septon droned on about the blessings of the Seven, Gendry's thoughts drifted to the simple life he had once known. Stoking the forge at dawn, hammer in hand, the heat of the coals on his face. But that was a realm away now, a memory receding behind him as swiftly as a far-off dream. When the septon placed a crown of black steel, laced with subtle gold accents, upon Gendry's head, the great hall erupted into cheers and echoing cries of "Long live the king!" The voices rose and collided among the carved pillars. Soldiers pounded their spears against the marble in thunderous rhythm, and the banners of House Tyrell fluttered side by side with the makeshift stag and hammer sigil. The ringing jubilation reverberated through Gendry's bones in a way that felt half terrifying, half exhilarating. Standing on Gendry's left was Margaery Tyrell, her face composed in a gracious, courtly smile. Though they were not yet wed, the realm already whispered of her as the future queen, a bride chosen to cement the alliance that had brought down the Lannisters. On Gendry's right stood Beric Dondarrion, wearing only a plain leather jerkin over his chainmail, his single eye solemn. Farther along the dais were other key figures of the new order. Lords from the Stormlands who had flocked to Gendry's cause once they recognized the ancient Baratheon heirloom, knights from the Riverlands who loathed the Lannisters for pillaging their lands, and the most influential Tyrell bannermen. Scattered among them were members of what was now Gendry's Kingsguard, a rough mix of newly raised knights, a few experienced warriors, and one or two men of uncertain repute but proven loyalty. Arya Stark observed from a place near the dais, wearing a comfortable tunic of gray wool. Even amidst the crowd, she stood out. A girl grown taller over the months of hardship, short hair framing her face, gray eyes keen and watchful. She had no interest in courtly rituals. She was here to see Joffrey's end realized, and she had indeed witnessed it with her own eyes mere days before. Now she quietly endured the spectacle, occasionally glancing at Gendry with an unreadable expression. He sensed her relief and her lingering sadness all at once. Her family was scattered or lost, and so much had changed, but at least Joffrey would never threaten anyone again. When the coronation ended, the crowd surged forward to pay homage. Lords knelt, ladies curtsied, and soldiers bowed their heads in turn. Gendry did his best not to look too bewildered. Margaery offered him a reassuring smile, placing her hand lightly on his arm as if to steady him. Then the ceremonial pace gave way to the swirl of a feast. Servants began ferrying platters of roast duck, steaming trays of spiced vegetables, and sweetmeats served in pastry shells. The great hall buzzed with conversation, speculation about the new reign, and more than a little relief that the Lannisters had been deposed, at least in King's Landing. Not all the Lannisters had been accounted for, of course. Lord Tywin had fled, presumably heading west to regroup with loyalist forces in the Westerlands. No one doubted he would mount a resistance or attempt a negotiation on his own terms. Jaime Lannister was absent, still rumored to be captive somewhere in the Riverlands or wandering free after escaping. Cersei had been taken in a short, brutal struggle within Maegor's holdfast. Gendry's mind flicked to the memory of how she spat curses at him, calling him a common-blooded impostor and the blacksmith's mistake. She had been dragged away in manacles, and the new council had decided to confine her to a remote sept under guard. Some urged her execution, but Gendry had declined to sign off on it. It was not mercy exactly. He simply could not stomach more killing when the war had already soaked the realm in blood. Even with Joffrey dead and Cersei disarmed, the Iron Throne was not secure. The Lannisters still held large swathes of territory to the west, and Euron Greyjoy's raiders were rumored to be harrying the coasts. In the north, the Boltons and the remaining loyalists to House Stark battled for dominance. Stannis Baratheon remained at Dragonstone, though his cause had waned after the Blackwater defeat. And far across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was said to be gathering power. The realm was hardly at peace, but for the moment, King's Landing stood behind Gendry Baratheon, or so he dared to hope. That night, after the last guests at the coronation feast had finally drifted away in a haze of wine and exhaustion, Gendry found himself alone in the king's solar. A single branch of candles burned on a polished table. The room was stifling, the drapes drawn tight against the autumn chill, and it smelled faintly of dust and old parchment. He took off the black steel crown and set it down with a clink. His head ached from wearing it for hours. Licking his lips, he poured himself a cup of watered wine, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. He could still hear the faint laughter and music drifting up from the lower halls. Some of the revelers had not yet found their beds. He felt the weight of too many decisions pressing on him. His new hand of the king needed to be named. The city's finances were a mess, thanks to the Lannisters' debts. The common folk demanded a measure of justice for Joffrey's cruelty. And overshadowing it all was the knowledge that a crown did not make him safe. It only painted a target on his back. A knock at the door startled him. He glanced up. "Enter," he called, standing straighter. The door opened to reveal Margaery Tyrell, still dressed in her coronation finery. Her gown was a rich green that accentuated her chestnut hair, pinned in an elegant coil. She slipped inside, shutting the door behind her. Gendry could see a flicker of caution in her eyes, as though she had debated whether to come at all. "Your Grace," she said softly, dipping a polite curtsy. He managed a half-smile. "It's late. You should rest." "So should you," she returned. Then she moved closer, letting her gaze slide across the sparse furnishings. This solar had been mostly unused since Robert's time, overshadowed by the Lannisters who had redecorated much of the Red Keep in their own style. A faint dryness hung in the air. "I wanted to see how you were holding up," she said. He looked down at the crown. "I keep thinking I'll wake up in Tobo Mott's smithy. All of this still feels unreal." Margaery gave a sympathetic tilt of her head. "It's no small thing to become king in such a fashion. You've a right to feel overwhelmed." "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do next," he admitted. "I hammered steel. I never learned how to hammer out treaties." She moved nearer until she was only a step away. Her perfume smelled of roses. "You don't have to do it alone. You'll have a council. My grandmother, Lady Olenna, can guide you in political matters. The realm needs a stable hand after so much chaos." The mention of Lady Olenna reminded Gendry that there were strings attached to the Tyrell support. Chief among them, he was expected to marry Margaery. He tried to read her expression. She seemed poised, but there was a glimmer of genuine empathy behind her eyes, or so he wanted to believe. She had been betrothed to Joffrey once, a nightmare in its own right. Now, she was betrothed to Gendry in the hope of forging a more tolerable alliance. Did she truly want this, or was it all a calculated move? He inclined his head, voice low. "I appreciate your counsel, my lady. I'll need every bit of help if I'm to rule wisely." A faint smile curved her lips. "We will take it one step at a time." They lingered a while, speaking softly about the immediate tasks, restoring order in the city, ensuring the flow of grain from the Reach, addressing the chaos left by the war. It was a relief to talk plainly. for Marjorie asked questions that reminded Gendry of the practicalities. More than once, she made a small joke that drew a quiet chuckle from his chest. When she finally departed, he felt a little steadier, as though the swirling storm of his thoughts had momentarily calmed. Still, in the echoing silence that followed her departure, he found himself gripping the onyx pendant beneath his tunic, a habit he had developed whenever he felt unmoored. The carved stag's head pressed coolly against his skin, reminding him of who he was. Robert's blood, though born in the gutters of King's Landing, shaped by an anvil, not a cradle. He prayed he would not repeat his father's shortcomings. The next morning, Gendry assembled a small council in the royal solar. The seat of hand of the king remained empty for the moment, and Gendry felt the absence keenly. He needed someone who was both politically adept and trustworthy, but the old courtiers had mostly fled or shown themselves to be deep in the Lannisters' pockets. The new lords in his orbit were either Tyrell partisans or stormlords who had never governed anything larger than a keep. Beric Dondarrion was a warrior and a devout follower of the Lord of Light, at least loosely, thanks to Thuras, but not a natural administrator. Thuras of Myr was too unconventional. Arya was a Stark, and she certainly had no desire to be a royal minister. And Marjorie's grandmother, Olenna, though formidable, was a Tyrell through and through. Her counsel would be invaluable, but Gendry worried about handing her the realm's second most powerful position outright. He did not want the crown to become a puppet for Highgarden. So he invited a handful of individuals, some known to him, others recommended by Beric or the lords who had joined his cause. Marjorie joined as well, sitting to Gendry's left. He felt better having her there. She radiated a composed confidence, even among strangers. Lady Olenna had chosen not to attend in person, probably to avoid overshadowing her granddaughter, but Gendry suspected her influence would weigh on everything said today. Across from Gendry sat Lord Edric Storm, a young man who had quietly arrived in King's Landing a few days after Joffrey's death, escorted by soldiers from Storm's End who had defied Stannis. Edric was another of Robert's acknowledged bastards, but he had grown up with some privileges and education in the Stormlands. The boy, though only a year or two younger than Gendry, had bright Baratheon eyes and an earnest manner. Upon meeting Gendry, Edric had knelt and pledged his sword, calling Gendry "Your Grace" without hesitation, as if relieved to have a brother he could follow rather than fear the Lannisters or Stannis' Red Priestess. Gendry found Edric's presence reassuring. Here was someone who shared a piece of his blood and might help him navigate the Stormlord's politics. Beside Edric sat Ser Perwyn Dondarrion, cousin to Beric, a knight with a shrewd mind for logistics. Next to him was Lady Subitta Frey, an older woman by marriage into House Frey but who had long detested the Lannisters. She wore a guarded expression, clearly aware that her Frey connections were suspect in many quarters. Thuras of Myr leaned against a side table, red robes loose, swirling a cup of ale. Arya perched on a windowsill, half listening, half glaring at the older lords as if daring them to insult her or Gendry. Others stood around the periphery, scribes and functionaries who had survived the Lannisters' purge. The air was thick with the tension of a new regime still trying to find its feet. Gendry cleared his throat. "We need a hand of the king," he began. "Someone who can help me manage the day-to-day affairs, advise me on decisions, keep the peace. Any suggestions?" Silence stretched, broken finally by Edric Storm. "Your Grace, Ser Davos Seaworth served as hand to Stannis, so I've heard," he said hesitantly. He was once a smuggler, a man of common birth who gained Stannis' respect. But with Stannis in self-imposed exile on Dragonstone, perhaps Ser Davos might be convinced to come serve you. If half the stories are true, he's an honest man. Gendry considered. That's one possibility, but Ser Davos is likely still loyal to Stannis. He glanced around. Any others? Lady Subitta Frey cleared her throat. What of Lord Wyman Manderley in the north? He is said to be cunning with finances and quite wealthy, though his loyalty was once to the Starks. The north is in chaos now, but if you could bring him south with an offer of an alliance, that might win you northern favor. That's an option, but it would take too long. I need a hand immediately, Gendry said, tapping a finger against the table. His gaze flicked to Beric, though Beric's gift was for leading men in battle, not for the unglamorous task of ruling. Marjorie spoke up in a calm voice. My grandmother is known for her wit and experience, though I understand your hesitation. Yet Lady Olenna truly does want stability. If you named her hand, she could be quite effective. Gendry saw several of the Stormlords exchange looks. They likely feared a Tyrell overshadowing a Baratheon king. But the realm was indeed in dire need of cunning leadership. Lady Olenna would outmaneuver Tywin if he tried anything from the west. On the other hand, Gendry was reluctant to appear as though the Tyrells were controlling him outright. He pressed his lips together, uncertain. Before he could decide, a voice from the corner spoke. There's another you might consider. All eyes turned to see a slight man with thinning brown hair, wearing modest dark robes, stepping forward. Gendry recognized him from the subdued corner of the Great Hall during the coronation feast, though they had not been introduced. I was once Grand Maester's aide. My name is Raymond Claren. I served under Lord Renly for a time, assisting with accounts at Highgarden. After Renly's death, I ended up in the city, overshadowed by the Lannisters. But I can attest to my knowledge of finances and counsel. I'd not presume to be hand, but I could at least serve on the council to keep the gold flowing. The meeting took a different turn then, delving into the realm's urgent needs. Paying the city watch, ensuring food stores for winter, securing trade routes. Gendry's head spun at the complexity. He realized that forging steel was child's play compared to forging a stable government. There were blacksmith secrets for shaping iron, but no straightforward formula for dealing with lords, coins, or the hearts of the people. By midday, they broke off with no definitive choice for hand. Marjorie caught Gendry's arm as he was leaving. We'll find someone soon, she assured. Meanwhile, you can count on my grandmother's guidance, even if she's not officially hand. And if you like, I can help keep an eye on the finances. I was taught from a young age how to run a household. Gendry smiled gratefully. I appreciate it, truly. He noticed Arya lingering by the door, waiting for him. He excused himself and walked with Arya down the corridor. The stone passages of the Red Keep felt different now that he was king. The same walls that once loomed over him and imprisoned him in a dungeon now seemed uncertain, awaiting his authority. It made him uneasy. Arya's gaze flicked up to him. So you've a new small council. Does that mean more sitting in boring meetings? He chuckled softly. Likely. Did you prefer the road? Scrounging for acorns to eat. A faint ghost of a smirk touched her lips, though her eyes remained cool. At least it was honest. He nodded. I know. All this politicking feels wrong, but it's necessary if we're to keep peace. Or make peace. They passed a row of slender windows overlooking the courtyard. The sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing in the still air. Arya spoke again, more quietly. I may not stay in King's Landing much longer. He stopped, turning to face her. Where will you go? North, she said, voice tight. My mother might be with Robb's forces, or she might be at Riverrun. I don't know. My sister Sansa. She hesitated. I've heard she fled the city or was forced to marry some Lannister ally. No one seems sure, but there must be Starks left in the north. That's my place, not here. He felt a pang, though he had known this moment would come. I understand. If there's anything I can do to help, provisions, guards to escort you, say the word. Arya's eyes flickered. Thank you. Perhaps I'll wait a few more days, just to be certain the roads are safe. But I can't linger here forever. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, unsure how she'd react. She did not shrug it off. Be careful, he said softly. The realm is still full of dangers, especially for a Stark. She nodded, swallowing whatever emotion threatened to surface, then turned on her heel and walked away. Gendry watched her go, remembering the fierce, determined girl he had met in Harrenhal's shadow. Time and war had changed them both. He hoped the next time they met, the world might be kinder. 3 days later, the capital stirred at the arrival of a visitor who had slipped through the gates with only a modest escort. It was Brienne of Tarth, come from the Riverlands, bearing urgent tidings. Gendry received her in the throne room, still uneasy with the pomp of the place. He sat on the iron throne in his new black and gold raiment, flanked by a handful of guards. The crowd of courtiers parted as Brienne approached. She was a tall, imposing figure in battered armor, dust from the road still clinging to her cloak. She knelt stiffly. "Your Grace." He leaned forward. "Rise, Lady Brienne. I'm told you bring word of the North." Her blue eyes flickered with sadness. "In part. I carry letters from Lady Catelyn Stark, who was my liege lady." She faltered, and Gendry feared the worst. "Lady Catelyn is dead, Your Grace, slain in the twins at what they call the Red Wedding. Lord Robb Stark too, betrayed by the Freys, aided by the Boltons." A shocked murmur spread across the hall. Gendry felt as though his breath had been punched from his lungs. Arya's mother and brother, gone? He glanced sideways at where Arya stood near a pillar, her face going white, fists clenched. For a moment, the entire throne room seemed to hang in a hush. Brienne continued, her voice thick. "I tried to reach them, but I was delayed. By the time I arrived, it was done. The Freys slaughtered the Starks and their men during a wedding feast. Roose Bolton took the north, though he faces resistance from loyal bannermen in scattered pockets." Arya took a step forward as if to speak, but her voice caught. Gendry steadied himself, nodding slowly. "That is dire news. The realm owes Lady Catelyn a great debt. She was an honorable woman." Brienne inclined her head. "I have more news. Lady Sansa Stark was wed to Tyrion Lannister before the Purple Wedding. Since then, no one seems certain of her whereabouts. Some say she fled during the chaos of Joffrey's downfall. Others say she's in the Vale under Lord Peter Baelish's protection." Arya's voice snapped, raw with hurt. "So my sister is missing? My mother and brother are dead? And the Boltons hold the North?" She trembled, rage and sorrow warring in her expression. Gendry knew this was a final blow to any illusions Arya might have harbored about finding her mother alive. The tall warrior turned to Arya, recognition lighting her eyes. She bowed her head. "My lady, I am sorry. If there is anything I can do to help you, I will. I swore an oath to your mother to protect the Stark girls." Arya just stared, tears bright in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. Gendry stood from the throne, descending the few iron steps. He placed a hand lightly on Arya's arm and faced Brienne. "Lady Brienne, if you have letters or tidings, let us discuss them in private council. We owe you thanks for bringing this news, terrible though it is." And so the court was dismissed, the murmuring courtiers drifting away, left to ponder the barbarity of the Red Wedding. Gendry, Arya, Brienne, Marjorie, and several close advisors retreated to a smaller council chamber. There, Brienne laid out more details. The Freys had declared for King Joffrey at the time, but with Joffrey toppled, their loyalty was uncertain. Roose Bolton was named Warden of the North by Tywin Lannister before Tywin fled. Now, Bolton sought to secure the North by stamping out any rival claimants. House Manderly, House Umber, House Karstark split among themselves, and various other northern clans resisted. But the North bled. Gendry could see how this news gutted Arya. She looked half numb, half murderous. Part of him wanted to shield her from it all, but she was no child. She had been forged by the same war that had thrown him onto the throne. As Brienne finished recounting the last known movements of Bolton forces, Gendry exhaled slowly. "We must decide how to respond. The North has never truly bowed to the Lannisters or their flunkies. If Bolton cements his power, he might become a threat as well." Beric Dondarrion nodded. "The Northern Lords might welcome your rule if you support their resistance. They have no love for the Lannisters or their allies." Marjorie chimed in softly. "And the Freys are widely despised now for their treachery. The entire realm looks upon the Red Wedding as a monstrous violation of guest right. If we move against them, we might gain support from many outraged lords." Arya's voice shook. "Then let's do it. Let's punish them for the Red Wedding. Let's free the North." Gendry's gaze flicked across the gathered faces. "It's easier said than done. we'd have to march an army north, through territories that may still harbor Lannister loyalists, or at least fear them. Our alliance is strong but not unassailable. Tywin is regrouping in the Westerlands. The Iron Islands are restless, and the realm's coffers are nearly empty. Brienne set her jaw. I will ride north alone if need be, to do what I can. But if you can spare men. He raised a hand gently. I won't send you alone, Lady Brienne. We owe it to the memory of the Starks. And the North's loyalty to Robert in the rebellion was strong. The old ties can be renewed, but we must move carefully. Let us plan. Over the ensuing hours, they mapped potential routes, supply lines, and the number of men that could be spared from King's Landing without leaving the capital vulnerable. There was also the thorny question of Stannis Baratheon. By rights, Stannis was Robert's legitimate brother, yet the realm now recognized Gendry as king. Would Stannis remain on Dragonstone, plotting his own return? Or would he ally with Gendry for the sake of deposing Roose Bolton? That evening, Gendry convened a war council with the Tyrell generals, Beric, and the new commander of the City Watch. They hammered out a plan to send a moderate force north to gather allies, focusing first on the Riverlands and any outraged lords who wanted to punish the Freys. Robb Stark's death had left House Tully in disarray, but the Tully holdouts might still muster a few thousand men if given leadership and resources. Thuras of Myr agreed to go as a liaison, calling on the Brotherhood without banners to help coordinate. With enough momentum, they might push into the neck and link up with the northern rebels. The entire plan bristled with risk, but the reward was a potential unification of North and South under Gendry's reign, and justice for the Stark family. Arya insisted on going with the northern host. No one was surprised. Gendry tried to dissuade her at first, worried about the dangers, but she met his concerns with cold determination. I have to see it through, she told him. They killed my mother and brother. The Boltons and Freys have to pay for that. I'm going. In the end, Gendry relented. He promised to ensure she had a proper escort, good armor, and a reliable horse. They parted in the courtyard the next morning. Arya wore a fitted leather jerkin over a mail shirt, a sword strapped at her side. Brienne stood with her, along with a squadron of men bearing the new Stag and Hammer standard. Beric embraced Gendry briefly before mounting his horse to ride alongside Arya and Brienne. Good luck, Gendry told them, anxiety knotting his stomach. Bring the North home. Arya nodded once. Her face was grim, but a spark of resolve lit her gray eyes. We will. Then they rode out, dust kicking up beneath their horses' hooves. Gendry watched until they disappeared through the city gates, a swirl of motion swallowed by the chaos of King's Landing. He felt an ache in his chest he could not name. War would continue, he knew. Peace was still a distant dream. Days bled into weeks as Gendry settled into the grueling tasks of ruling the capital. The City Watch needed a thorough reorganization. Too many of the old officers had sold their loyalty to the Lannisters. Crime in Flea Bottom was rampant due to the chaos of war and refugees. Food prices soared, stirring discontent among the commoners who had once cheered Gendry's name. At the same time, Ravens arrived with troubling news from the west. Tywin Lannister had fortified Casterly Rock and begun rallying houses sworn to the Lion. Skirmishes erupted along the border of the Reach. Some concluded Tywin was testing the Tyrell lines, seeking weaknesses. Meanwhile, the Iron Bank of Bravos pressed for repayment of the crown's massive debts. Debts that had accumulated under Robert and the Lannisters. Gendry found himself staring at ledgers of incomprehensible numbers late into the night. The sums were enormous. The Red Keep's treasury was near empty except for what the Tyrells and other supporters had contributed. Marjorie and her grandmother tried to soothe matters with the Iron Bank, negotiating partial payments or new loan terms. But the bank was known for its relentless pursuit of debts. A crown that defaulted risked the bank funding its enemies. During these weeks, Gendry found small moments of solace in the Royal Forge. Tucked away in the depths of the Red Keep was an unused smithy, abandoned since King Robert's earliest days. Gendry had insisted on having it restored. He employed several blacksmiths to keep the city guards well armed, but in quieter moments, he would slip down there himself, shrugging off his kingly raiment and rolling up his sleeves to grip the hammer once again. It was a comfort to feel the sting of sparks and breathe in the tang of hot metal. More than once, Marjorie came to find him there, only to watch from a safe distance, a fond smile on her lips as he shaped steel with a concentration born of old habit. He would glance up at her, cheeks smudged with soot, and she would laugh softly, as if reminded that beneath the crown was still the blacksmith boy. At last, after much deliberation, Gendry named his hand of the king. He settled on an unexpected choice, Lord Mallister, a respected but not overly powerful lord from the Riverlands who had joined the cause in disgust at the Red Wedding. Lord Mallister had a reputation for fairness and had once served in King Robert's broader councils. Though Lady Olenna remained Gendry's unofficial guide in most matters of court intrigue, naming Mallister as hand offered a gesture of balance. Neither a Tyrell nor a Stormlord, but a moderate Riverlands voice. Some lords grumbled that Mallister lacked the cunning to match Tywin Lannister, but Gendry hoped that straightforward fairness might serve better than cunning in the long run. One autumn evening, Marjorie invited Gendry to walk with her through the gardens of the Red Keep. Gardens that had seen neglect under the Lannisters but were now being replanted with hardier blooms from the Reach. The crisp air smelled faintly of turned earth and fresh mulch. Lanterns dotted the pathways, illuminating the vibrant flowers that had survived. They strolled side by side, Marjorie's arm looped through Gendry's. The hush of the hour felt peaceful after days of endless demands and decisions. She studied his face. "You look troubled," she observed. He let out a breath. "Worrying about the North, about the West, about everything. I still feel as though I'm playing a role someone else wrote, and one misstep will bring everything crashing down." She patted his arm. "That's the nature of kingship in times of war. You never truly feel secure. But you've done well so far. The city no longer starves, we have allies from Dorne discussing an envoy, and the people are mostly content." He nodded, lips pursed. "But Tywin," she squeezed his arm gently. "Yes, Tywin Lannister is a formidable foe, but we have the Tyrell army behind us, and your own supporters. We have outraged lords from the Riverlands still thirsting for justice. We must remain vigilant. If we unite enough houses, Tywin cannot stand alone." He turned to her, halting under the soft glow of a lantern. "Marjorie, about our betrothal." He trailed off, unsure how to phrase his concerns. The realms expected them to marry soon, to formalize the alliance. But Gendry found himself torn between duty and the sense that he barely knew her. She was kind, sharp-witted, and appealing, but their entire relationship hinged on political necessity. Marjorie seemed to sense his unease. "You worry we're moving too quickly?" "Yes and no," he confessed. "I understand the logic. The realm needs stability, but I don't want to treat you as a piece in the Game of Thrones, just as I don't want to be a piece in that same game. You deserve more than that." For a moment, she looked surprised. Then she smiled softly. "Most kings would see marriage as part of the bargain, but I respect that you care about my own wishes." Her gaze drifted to the lantern light reflecting in the small fountain nearby. "I've been betrothed before, to Renly and then to Joffrey. Those were not love matches. With Renly I had hopes, but I was naive to many things. With Joffrey, well, I quickly learned his nature." A chill passed between them at the memory of Joffrey's cruelty. Marjorie steadied herself. "I know this is a political marriage, but that doesn't mean we cannot make something genuine of it. We can become allies in truth, share goals, perhaps even a friendship or love in time. I'm willing to try, if you are." Gendry felt a warmth in his chest. He nodded, placing his free hand over hers. "I am." She squeezed his fingers once, then released him. They walked on, discussing wedding plans in a tentative way, as though testing the waters. Likely, a grand royal wedding would have to wait until the realm was more stable and the financial situation improved. But the betrothal would be formally announced soon, pleasing the lords who demanded such traditions. For a while, they strolled in companionable silence, letting the hush of the garden envelop them. The moon was high, illuminating the Red Keep's walls in silver. Gendry wondered if his father had ever walked these same paths with Cersei, or if Robert had always been too restless, roaming taverns and brothels instead. He was determined not to repeat that pattern. He would treat Margaery with respect and try, in his own stumbling way, to honor the bond they were forging. News from the north began trickling in. Thuras of Myr sent several ravens describing how Arya, Beric, Brienne, and their combined host had defeated small pockets of Frey men near the Trident, earning the support of outraged riverlords. House Blackwood and House Mallister, whose lord was now Gendry's hand, rose to fight. More skirmishes broke out. The Freys retreated behind the walls of the twins, apparently hoping Tywin Lannister would come to their aid. But Tywin was busy fortifying the west and had no desire to expend men defending the Freys' ill-gotten gains, at least not yet. Arya led a scouting party that managed to intercept a Frey supply train, capturing it without heavy losses, a feat that earned her grudging respect from the soldiers. Beric wrote that she seemed tireless, fueled by the need to avenge her family. It worried him, but no one could deny she had a knack for reading terrain and making swift, daring strikes. Her courage bolstered morale among the northern loyalists who saw in Arya the living spirit of the Starks. By the time winter's first snows dusted the high passes, the rebel host had advanced well beyond the Trident, poised to cross into the Neck. Roose Bolton, however, still held Winterfell, and the dreaded Ramsay Bolton terrorized the countryside. Gendry read these reports by the dim light of the royal solar each evening. He pictured Arya astride a horse, directing men twice her age with flinty resolve. The image made him proud and uneasy at the same time. The Freys had proven themselves treacherous. The Boltons were rumored to be even worse. The road ahead would be bloody. Meanwhile, ravens arrived from Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon, it seemed, was at last ready to parley. Gendry felt a jolt of apprehension at the news. Stannis might have seen Gendry as an obstacle or even a usurper of the Baratheon claim. Yet the letter, written in a terse style that matched Stannis's reputation, proposed a meeting at a neutral location along the Rose Road. Stannis demanded acknowledgement as Gendry's uncle and rightful heir if Gendry died without offspring. In exchange, Stannis would lay down his claim to the Iron Throne and rally his loyalists behind Gendry, provided certain conditions were met. The letter hinted at old grievances and the need to punish the Lannisters, but it did not mention the Red Witch or Shadow assassinations. Gendry found it difficult to read behind the lines. He convened a council to discuss the letter with Margaery, Lord Mallister, Lady Olenna, and a handful of other notables present. Olenna scoffed at the notion of trusting Stannis, pointing out how he had used dark arts, or so the rumors said, to kill Renly. Margaery cautioned that an alliance with Stannis might bring fewer men than they hoped, as many of his bannermen had died at Blackwater or deserted. Lord Mallister pointed out that if Stannis came peacefully, it would prevent a potential second front from Dragonstone. They argued back and forth until Gendry pinned the matter down. He would meet Stannis, but do so carefully, with a strong guard and strict conditions. If an accord could be reached, better to have Stannis as an ally than an enemy. If not, well, they would be ready. And so, in late autumn, Gendry traveled south along the Rose Road, accompanied by a company of mounted knights and footmen bearing his new sigil. It was the first time he had left King's Landing since taking the throne. Margaery remained behind to manage the city's affairs with Lord Mallister. The ride felt strangely liberating. He was away from the suffocating corridors of the Red Keep, able to feel the wind on his face. Though the fields were brown and the nights chilled by approaching winter, Gendry could not help a small surge of pleasure at being outside, under open skies. They set up a large pavilion in a clearing near Bitterbridge, the designated meeting spot. The local lords, still uncertain, had cleared an open field for the royal retinue. Gendry waited there with a select guard, scanning the horizon for signs of Stannis. By midday, a column of men in plate and mail approached, bearing banners of the Flaming Heart. Stannis rode at the front, stiff-backed and stony-faced, red hair receding at the temples, a short beard flecked with gray. Beside him rode a woman in red robes, Melisandre of Ass High. Gendry felt a chill at the memory of rumors swirling around her. how she had used dark magic to strike at her master's foes. The two parties halted at a cautious distance before Gendry's herald signaled for them to approach. Stannis dismounted, as did Gendry. Neither man smiled. Stannis inclined his head in an almost bow. "Your Grace," he said with a sour emphasis, as if tasting the words. Gendry offered a slow nod. "Welcome, uncle." At that, Stannis's face twitched, perhaps acknowledging Gendry's attempt to honor the family tie. The Red Woman watched with an inscrutable smile. The two groups retreated to the pavilion, where a table had been set up with chairs, bread, and salt for courtesy. Gendry's men hovered outside, tension in every line of their bodies. Stannis had brought fewer men overall, but they seemed disciplined and watchful. The scene felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. In the pavilion, the air was still, lit only by daylight filtering through the canvas walls. Gendry took a seat at one end of the table, Stannis at the other. Melisandre stood behind Stannis, the red of her robe catching every flicker of light. Gendry could feel her eyes on him, assessing, as though he were a puzzle. Stannis was first to speak. "I sent you terms. Do you agree to them?" Gendry's jaw tightened. "That depends on whether you'll truly set aside your claim to the throne." Stannis let out a breath, his tone clipped. "I do not believe you outrank me by law. I am Robert's trueborn brother, whereas you are a bastard, yes." Gendry cut in, bristling. "But the realm has accepted me as king. Even many of Robert's old bannermen stand behind me. We can argue the legalities all day, but what matters is whether you're prepared to fight me or join me." Stannis's lips thinned. "Robert was my older brother, and I was next in line by all the laws of the Seven Kingdoms. However, that is undone. I lost too many men at Blackwater. The realm, by your contrivance with the Tyrells, has embraced you. I see that I might not take the throne without unleashing more bloodshed. And there are other concerns at hand." He glanced at Melisandre. "The night is darkening, and winter comes. This war among kings only weakens us." Gendry blinked, not expecting that last statement. "What do you mean?" Melisandre's voice filled the pavilion, low and resonant. "Shadows are stirring in the far north, your grace. Stannis has seen the signs in the flames. The true war is not between mortal kings, but between light and darkness. If the realm is to survive, the living must unite." Gendry had heard rumors of the White Walkers beyond the wall, but so many in the south dismissed them as myth. He studied Stannis's expression and saw no humor or trickery, only grim conviction. Could it be that Stannis's Red Priestess had shown him something real? Stannis rapped the table with his knuckles. "I propose we combine our forces under one banner, yours. In return, you will acknowledge me as your heir should you perish without offspring. You will also commit men to defend the wall, for the Night's Watch is undermanned, and the threat beyond the wall is real." Gendry frowned. "What threat exactly?" The Red Woman's eyes seemed to glow. "The dead walking, creatures of ice and cold, commanded by a darkness older than this realm. They gather in the wastes. The free folk flee south, and soon they will come in greater numbers. If the wall falls, all of Westeros will be in jeopardy. Our petty squabbles over crowns will mean nothing." Gendry looked to Stannis. "You mean to defend the realm from these White Walkers?" "Yes," Stannis said curtly. "I would do what must be done, but we need the realm's strength unified. Your father, Robert, never believed in such tales, but times have changed. The dead do not care about a blacksmith's blood or a lord's birthright. They come to kill." Silence gripped the pavilion. Gendry recalled old stories told by traveling soldiers. He had never paid them much mind, caught up in forging steel and surviving day to day. Yet the sincerity on Stannis's face was undeniable. This was not a man known for jest. "How do you propose we defend the north from these beings?" Gendry asked quietly. Stannis spread his hands. "First, we rally what remains of the north. We rid it of traitors like Roose Bolton and the Freys who hamper any true defense. We restore order so that men may man the wall without fear of their homes behind them. Then we fortify the Night's Watch, send them aid, and prepare for a war like none we've seen." Gendry let that sink in. It aligned strangely well with Gendry's own need to pacify the North and see justice done for the Starks. Another war, a different threat, a horrifying one if true. He studied Stannis's weathered face. "You'll bend the knee to me as king, publicly, if I accept these terms?" Stannis's jaw worked. For a long moment, the older man said nothing, as if forcing down a bitter pill. "I will, in the interest of the realm. I will also stand as one of your commanders, leading men against the threat in the north. If you break faith, however—" "I won't," Gendry said, "though I'd prefer to name my own heir if and when I have one." Stannis nodded grudgingly. "Of course, my claim stands only until such time as you have an heir of your own body. If that day comes, I'll accept it." The Red Woman leaned forward, her tone velvety. "The Lord of Light has shown us a path, two flames merging to become a brighter blaze. Many in the south do not yet believe in this threat, but they soon will. Winter is here." Gendry suppressed a shiver. He reached out, clasping Stannis's forearm. "Then let us set aside our differences. We face a greater enemy." Stannis met his grip. "So be it." Outside the pavilion, Gendry's guards shifted uneasily, uncertain of what passed within. But after a short while, Gendry and Stannis emerged together, side by side. Their men exchanged wary looks. Stannis's herald raised the flaming heart banner, while Gendry's standard of the crowned stag and hammer fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze. Few words were spoken as the two camps began to intermingle, sharing bread and salt. It was an uneasy alliance, but an alliance nonetheless. If the White Walkers truly threatened the realm, unity would be desperately needed. By late autumn, Gendry had returned to King's Landing with an unexpected decree. Stannis Baratheon was pardoned for any acts of rebellion and named Lord Commander of the Northern Expedition. Whispers raced through the streets. The small folk, long told that Stannis was a dangerous pretender, were confused. But many lords recognized the value of having a seasoned commander join the push against Roose Bolton and the Freys. Tywin Lannister still lurked in the west, but for the moment, news of this alliance gave him pause. The combination of Tyrell's strength, Gendry's new monarchy, and Stannis's surviving loyalists was formidable. Margaery Tyrell and Lady Olenna greeted the news with mixed relief. They saw the logic in broadening the alliance but still harbored distrust for Stannis, and especially for Melisandre. Olenna sardonically noted that the Red Woman might cause trouble at court. Gendry agreed to keep her influence in check. Nonetheless, Stannis set out almost immediately, mustering an army from Storm's End and Dragonstone loyalists, planning to march north to reinforce Arya's efforts. The newly formed Baratheon Tyrell monarchy, battered as it was slowly knitting the realm back together. Winter's grip tightened. Cold winds blew from the north. Reports of early snows blanketed the neck, making marches slower. But the combined Riverlander and Northern Loyalist force under Arya, Beric, and Brienne pressed on doggedly. Roose Bolton, rumored to be cunning and ruthless, sought to hold Winterfell by forging alliances with lesser houses desperate for stability. Ramsay Bolton terrorized any who resisted. The stories that came south spoke of unimaginable cruelty. Flayed men, burned villages, hunts of innocent peasants for sport. It drove more of the north into revolt, though fear paralyzed many. As the year's end approached, a new crisis roiled King's Landing. From the west came word that Tywin Lannister had launched raids into the Reach, burning fields and scattering peasants. It seemed Tywin hoped to draw the Tyrell forces away from supporting Gendry so he could isolate the crown. In response, Lady Olenna demanded that Gendry march west immediately, crush Tywin, and end the Lannister threat. But Gendry hesitated. He had already committed men northward. Splitting the royal forces again to face Tywin might leave King's Landing vulnerable. Yet ignoring Tywin would alienate the Tyrells, who were the backbone of the new regime's power. The dilemma weighed heavily on Gendry's mind. Late one night, he stood atop the Red Keep's ramparts, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the chill. Below him, the city's lights glimmered like scattered stars. His breath misted in the air. He was wrestling with the decision when Marjorie appeared at his side, also cloaked, her cheeks flushed from the cold climb. She joined him at the parapet, gazing out over the sleeping capital. "You'll catch a chill," she said softly. "I needed some air." He looked at her, noticing how the moonlight outlined her features. The Tyrells want immediate action against Tywin. Stannis wants more men for the north. I can't do both at once, not easily. She folded her arms, exhaling a slow breath. "My grandmother believes an immediate offensive against Tywin is the only way to protect the Reach. She fears Tywin will erode our power base if left unchecked. But I've also heard how urgent the northern campaign is. Arya writes that Bolton is growing bolder." He shook his head, frustration mounting. "I can't fight on two fronts effectively. The realm is still recovering. Gods, Marjorie, every day I discover another hidden cost or debt or problem. I wish I could fix it all with a hammer blow, but it's not that simple." She placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Perhaps there's a way to handle Tywin without a full campaign. Could we consider a diplomatic approach? Offer him terms if he stands down." Gendry snorted softly. "Tywin only respects strength. He's not likely to back down unless we show we can beat him. But maybe we don't need to crush him outright. If we strike a few decisive blows, capture some key strongholds in the west, he might be forced to negotiate." Marjorie nodded slowly. "That might be enough to keep him off balance. Meanwhile, the majority of our forces can go north. The question is who leads the campaign against Tywin." Gendry thought a moment. "I can't abandon the capital entirely, but I can't stay idle while the Tyrells risk everything. Perhaps I should go west myself, commanding a smaller, elite force, enough to prove we're serious. Meanwhile, Lord Mallister and you can hold King's Landing, and more troops can be sent to the north." She studied his expression. "You trust me to watch over the city?" He nodded. "I do. People adore you here, Marjorie. They trust you to care for them. And you have Lady Olenna and the City Watch. Tyrion Lannister was rumored to have surviving loyalists in the city. But if they cause trouble, we'll rely on your cunning to root them out." She gave a small, wry smile. "Very well, but be careful. Tywin has outmaneuvered men far more experienced than you." He placed a hand over hers. "I know, but I won't be alone. I'll bring some of our best knights, and the Tyrell outriders. If I can secure a swift victory or two, take a castle, maybe rout one of his armies, he might be forced to retreat." A hush fell. The wind tugged at their cloaks. After a moment, Gendry squeezed Marjorie's hand gently, then released it. "We'll finalize plans tomorrow. For now, I need some rest. Winter is only just beginning." A fortnight later, Gendry rode out of King's Landing at the head of a lean column of cavalry and infantry. The banners of the crowned stag and hammer flew beside the Tyrell rose. They headed west under a stark winter sky, their breath steaming, hoofbeats thudding on cold ground. Behind them, the city gates shut, leaving Marjorie and Lord Mallister in command. Gendry's mission was to strike at the edges of Tywin's newly expanded domain, draw out a response, and show that the crown would not abandon the Reach. The march was grueling, but the men were in decent spirits. Many of the common soldiers revered Gendry as a man of the people who had risen from the smithy to the throne. Some talked openly in campfires at night about how they believed Gendry would bring a fairer rule, recalling the best days of Robert's youth. Gendry listened with a mix of humility and dread. His father's reign had ended in drunkenness and debt, yet the people remembered the strong, laughing warrior who had overthrown the Mad King. Gendry wanted to embody something better. The roads grew rougher as they passed into territory contested by Lannister patrols. Occasionally, scouts reported sightings of enemy outriders. Gendry ordered caution. He refused to let the column stray into an ambush. By day, they pressed on carefully. By night, they fortified their camps with sentries. Winter's gloom settled early each evening, and the men huddled around fires. Gendry often joined them, ignoring the courtiers who insisted he maintain a regal distance. He would share a mug of ale, talk about their families, ask about the fortunes of their villages. That closeness boosted morale, though some of the older knights grumbled that a king must preserve an air of mystery. Gendry cared more about forging unity. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of a small fortress that served as a Lannister outpost. The place was known as Stonewick Hall, perched atop a rocky rise overlooking a key road into the Reach. Lannister banners flapped from its towers, and watchers on the battlements eyed Gendry's approaching force warily. Reconnaissance suggested the garrison was moderate, perhaps a few hundred men. Gendry's own force nearly matched it, though storming a fortress was always costly. His plan, however, involved a simple siege and negotiation. If the Lannisters refused to yield, he would test them in open battle if they sallied out. If not, he would attempt to starve them into surrender. The siege began quietly. Gendry set up lines around Stonewick Hall, blocking supply routes. A few half-hearted skirmishes broke out when Lannister riders tried to slip away. Gendry's men captured them, and the watchers on the walls soon realized they would receive no relief from Tywin's main army anytime soon. A week dragged on, then two, under slate-gray skies that spat occasional flurries of snow. Supplies ran short on both sides. Gendry worried about the possibility of disease in the camp. He recalled all too well the horror stories of siege warfare. He tried sending envoys to the fortress, offering fair terms. Yield, lay down arms, and swear fealty, or at least neutrality, and they would be spared. The commander, a hard-bitten knight named Ser Loren Lydon, refused, apparently hoping Tywin would arrive. But Tywin did not come. Scouts reported his main host was further west, locked in a standoff with the Tyrell defenders near Ashmark. With each passing day, the fortress's supplies dwindled. Finally, on the 15th day, a battered white flag appeared atop the ramparts. A small party emerged, led by Ser Loren, who limped slightly. He removed his helm, revealing a haggard face. "I would speak with your king," he said in a rasp. Gendry rode out under his own flag of truce. They met between the lines, the ground trampled into frozen mud. Ser Loren surveyed Gendry as though trying to reconcile the image of a tall, broad-shouldered young man in half-plate with the idea of a blacksmith's bastard turned king. Gendry raised his visor. "Ser Loren, I have offered fair terms. Do you yield?" The knight exhaled, fatigue etched in every line of his face. "I yield the castle to you on condition that my men and I be granted safe passage. We will not swear fealty. We will simply depart." Gendry considered. He could demand they bend the knee, but it might be more trouble than it was worth. "Agreed. Disarm, leave your weapons behind, and you may depart unmolested." Ser Loren hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well." In this small but symbolic victory, Stonewick Hall fell without a pitched battle. Gendry took possession of the fortress, installing a garrison of his own men. Ser Loren and his garrison trudged away, no doubt to rejoin Tywin and report that the new king had seized a foothold in the west. Word soon spread among the local villages. Some were relieved, others fearful of Lannister retaliation. Gendry made sure to keep discipline in the ranks, ordering no looting or harassment of commoners. He wanted to show that his rule was different. As they settled into Stonewick, Gendry's scouts brought fresh news. The Tyrells had won a minor victory against a Lannister raiding party near Golden Grove, forcing them to retreat. Tywin's attempts to intimidate the Reach had stalled. Further updates told of the northern campaign. Arya and Stannis were rumored to have joined forces near the Neck, pressing relentlessly against the Freys. The realm was slowly turning against the Lannisters and their allies. Perhaps, Gendry dared hope, the war might not last forever. Still, Tywin was a master strategist. The man had once orchestrated the sacking of King's Landing during Robert's rebellion, turning the tide in Robert's favor at the last moment only to secure his own advantages. Gendry knew he could not underestimate Tywin's cunning. Stonewick Hall was just one small step. If Tywin chose to muster his main strength and confront Gendry, the newly crowned king might find himself outnumbered. Winter advanced in earnest, dusting the hills with snow. Gendry's men huddled within the fortress, grateful at least for a roof over their heads. Sentries kept watch day and night, Gendry busied himself reviewing patrol reports and drafting letters to Marjorie. He wrote of the siege's resolution, the vow not to shed needless blood, and his hope that they could coax more Lannister-held castles to surrender. Marjorie's replies were swift and encouraging, though she mentioned growing tensions in the city as merchants complained about high taxes for war funds. She and Lord Mallister tried to keep the populace calm, reminding them that Tywin's threat must be answered, or the fighting would simply wash back onto King's Landing. As Yuletide approached, the men grew restless. Gendry remembered his own younger days in Flea Bottom, how the approach of midwinter meant hunger and cold, with little enough joy. He could not promise them a feast, but he allowed some measure of celebration. A small cask of ale for each cohort, a modest meal of roasted onions and salted pork for all, and a few half-day rests from fortifications. The soldiers seemed grateful. In the Stonewick yard, someone produced a battered lute, and a few songs rose into the frosty air. Gendry stood on the battlements listening, a bittersweet ache in his chest. He was their king, yet he felt apart, an outsider. It reminded him of forging alone in Tobo Mott's smithy late at night. The sense of isolation weighed on him. He was roused from these musings when a pair of scouts arrived, breathless from a swift ride. "Your Grace," one said, bowing. "We've sighted smoke to the south, possibly a Lannister force burning farmland. They carry the Lion Banner." At once, Gendry roused his captains, ordering a cavalry detachment to ride out. He donned his armor, hammered from good steel and etched with the crowned stag. He took up a warhammer rather than a sword, fitting for a blacksmith king, though some knights muttered that a sword was more proper. Gendry felt more at home with a hammer's weight in his grip. In the cold dawn light, he led a column of horsemen out from Stonewick Hall, the breath of the mounts pluming in the air. Snow crunched under iron-shod hooves. They followed the smoke, a black smudge against the pale sky. Soon they came upon a small hamlet in flames. Women and children fled from burning cottages, chased by Lannister outriders. Gendry's blood ran hot at the sight. He gave the order, and his cavalry thundered forward. The Lannister men-at-arms, perhaps only a few dozen, turned in alarm. They scrambled to form a line, but Gendry's men struck before they could organize. Steel clashed on steel. Gendry swung his hammer, feeling the jolt as it connected with a Lannister spearman's shield. The man crumpled under the impact. Another lunged at Gendry with a pike, but Gendry twisted aside, hooking the pike with his hammer's head and yanking it free. His horse reared, hooves flailing at the foe. The clash lasted only moments before the Lannisters broke and tried to flee. Most were cut down. A handful threw down their weapons, begging quarter. Panting, Gendry reined in his horse. The smell of smoke and blood mingled in the air. Cries rose from the villagers, their meager homes ablaze. Gendry dismounted, hammer in hand, scanning the chaos. He saw an old woman huddled against a broken cart, tears streaking her soot-stained face. Another villager lay bleeding in the snow. The survivors gaped at Gendry's banner, uncertain whether to fear or welcome these new arrivals. "Help them!" Gendry shouted to his soldiers. "Form a bucket line. Put out the fires if we can." The soldiers obeyed. Some sprinted to the frozen well, hacking at the ice to draw water. Others guided the survivors away from the blaze. Gendry knelt by the wounded villager, pressing a hand to a gushing wound. "Medic!" he bellowed. One of the knights, who had some skill with bandages, rushed over. Gendry's leather gauntlet grew slick with blood as he tried to stanch it. The man's eyes rolled back, breath rattling. Gendry felt a surge of helplessness. He had hammered steel but never learned the ways to mend human flesh. By the time the fires were extinguished, half the hamlet was ash, and 2 villagers lay dead. Many others were injured or left homeless in the biting cold. Gendry ordered his quartermaster to distribute provisions. The Lannister prisoners, 6 in all, were bound and questioned. They claimed to be part of a larger raiding party led by a minor Lannister cousin, intending to pillage the region to draw Gendry out. A heavy gloom settled over Gendry. This was the reality of war. Not glorious charges, but innocents burned out of their homes. He realized that if he pressed deeper into Lannister lands, more villages might suffer. Yet to do nothing meant letting Tywin pillage the Reach or anywhere else unopposed. There was no neat solution. That evening, he rode back to Stonewick Hall with the rescued villagers in tow, providing them shelter behind the castle walls, at least until they could be relocated. Some soldiers grumbled about feeding more mouths, but Gendry refused to turn them away. The knights who had fought bravely told each other stories of how the blacksmith king swung his hammer like Robert Reborn. Gendry took no comfort in such talk. He was haunted by the sight of the old woman's tears and the lifeless bodies in the snow. Winter's darkest stretch passed with slow days of bitter cold. Letters from King's Landing arrived intermittently. Marjorie wrote that the city endured, though tensions simmered among merchants. A letter from Lady Olenna praised Gendry's siege success and urged him to deliver a decisive blow soon, or Tywin would drag the conflict out until the realm bled. Meanwhile, Stannis reported progress in the north. Arya and her rebels had laid siege to the twins, capturing Walder Frey's grandson in a cunning night assault. The Freys were thus pinned down, and with each passing day, more northern lords rallied to the true cause, forsaking Bolton. The Watchers on the Wall also pleaded for men to guard against wildling incursions. Gendry marveled at how many crises battered the realm all at once. Finally, as the snows began to subside with the promise of early spring, Gendry gathered his captains for a bold stroke. Tywin's main force had withdrawn near Casterly Rock, or so the scouts claimed. His second-largest host remained near Ashmark, shadowing Tyrell positions. Gendry proposed a swift strike westward, capturing or undermining Ashmark so the Tyrells could press forward. If they succeeded, Tywin's supply lines would be threatened, forcing him to treat with Gendry or risk encirclement. The captains agreed on the plan, though it carried risks. They packed up from Stonewick Hall, leaving a small garrison behind, and marched west along narrow roads flanked by snow-laden hills. Spirits were guardedly high. Some men joked that they'd see the sunset over the Sunset Sea if they marched far enough. After a week of travel, they approached Ashmark's outskirts. The land here was stony and mountainous in places, giving defenders an advantage. Sure enough, Lannister outriders harassed their vanguard, forcing Gendry's men to move slowly. On the third day near Ashmark, they encountered a well-entrenched Lannister force blocking the pass. The Golden Lion banners snapped in a brisk wind. The sun glinted off rows of pikes. Gendry reined in, surveying the line from a small rise. The enemy commander was not Tywin himself, but a cousin or trusted bannerman, newly reinforced from the west. They had the high ground. Gendry's own men formed up, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center. His archers took position on a rocky slope. He felt the pulse in his ears. This would be his first open field battle as king. The knights around him looked tense, grips tight on reins and lances. One of his commanders, a gruff knight named Ser Devron, growled, "They outnumber us slightly, your grace. We must rely on surprise or cunning." Gendry nodded. "We hold formation. Let our archers soften them if they advance. If they hold position, we might try to flank them with the cavalry." A horn blast echoed across the pass. The Lannister line began to move. Gendry inhaled, adrenaline surging. "Archers!" he cried. A volley of arrows arced through the gray sky, peppering the Lannister ranks. Some men fell, but the line kept advancing. Snow churned underfoot. Gendry readied his hammer, scanning for the best angle of attack. Then the lines clashed. The sound was a deafening roar of steel, screams, and war cries. Gendry spurred his horse into the fray, hammer raised. He brought it crashing down on a Lannister shieldsman, sending him sprawling. Another lunged with a spear, grazing Gendry's thigh plate. Gendry hammered the spear aside and caught the man with a backswing. All around him, men struggled in the churned snow, slipping on ice and gore. The clang of swords melded with the shrieks of wounded horses. For a time, it seemed the Lannisters might overwhelm the center. Gendry's cavalry hammered into their flank, but the pass was narrow, limiting the advantage of mounted knights. The Lannisters fought with desperate vigor. Gendry glimpsed a standard-bearer near the enemy lines, urging men forward. If he could topple that banner, it might break their morale. He bellowed for a wedge of knights to follow him. They crashed toward the standard-bearer. Gendry's arm burned from the weight of the hammer, but he refused to yield. He battered aside a shield, trampling another foe. A pike jabbed at his horse's flank, and his mount shrieked, stumbling. Gendry leaped clear just as the horse went down, rolling in the slush. He came up on one knee, hammer in hand, faced by two Lannister spearmen. One thrust forward. Gendry sidestepped, hooking the spear with the hammer's head and wrenching it away. The second man aimed at Gendry's midsection. Gendry barely twisted aside. The spear grazed his mail, sending shock waves through his ribs. Ignoring the pain, he lunged inside the spear's reach, smashing the hammer into the man's breastplate. A sickening crunch followed. His vision blurred with exertion. Another Lannister soldier came at him from behind. Gendry turned, but not fast enough. He braced for a blow, only for the soldier to crumple, an arrow in his throat. One of Gendry's archers had saved him. Gendry nodded in thanks, panting. Then he pressed forward, stumbling over corpses. The standard-bearer was just ahead, brandishing a longsword. They locked eyes. Gendry swung. The banner lion tried to parry, but Gendry's hammer smashed into his guard, knocking him back. One more swing, and the standard-bearer toppled, the lion banner falling from his grasp into the bloody snow. A roar went up from Gendry's men. The Lannisters wavered. The wedge of knights pushed through, claiming the broken banner. Some Lannisters broke ranks, fleeing uphill. Others cast down their weapons. Before long, the pass belonged to Gendry. Yet the victory was costly. Bodies littered the battlefield, many wearing the stag and hammer tabard. Some moaned, others lay still. Gendry stood in the midst of it, hammered sword from the dying man's grip, breath ragged. This was triumph? His knights congratulated him. They praised his bravery, calling him the Hammer King, Robert Reborn, and other grand titles. Gendry felt only hollow fatigue. He barked orders for the wounded to be tended, for the dead to be gathered. He demanded that the Lannister prisoners be treated fairly. If Tywin would call him a bastard king, Gendry would at least show more mercy than the Lannisters ever had. Still, he could not wash away the memory of men's screams. With the pass cleared, the way to Ashmark lay open. Some predicted the castle would capitulate now that its defenders had been routed. Scouts rode ahead, returning with news that the garrison had indeed retreated. Gendry's forces took Ashmark the next morning without further bloodshed. Another fortress in the west fell under the blacksmith king's banner. This success signaled a shift in power. Reports indicated that Tywin had pulled back toward Casterly Rock, uncertain if he could hold the outer castles. The Tyrells advanced from the south, linking up with Gendry's gains. Western lords, long fed up with the endless war, began murmuring about a negotiated settlement. Perhaps Tywin's grip was weakening at last. Yet, as Gendry established a garrison at Ashmark, a raven arrived bearing dire news from the north. Roose Bolton had abandoned Winterfell to the forces of Arya and Stannis, but not before burning large sections of the castle and disappearing. Worse, Ramsay Bolton had fled into the countryside, continuing his reign of terror. The letter described grim scenes of charred walls and corpses left as a final insult to House Stark. Arya and Stannis now held Winterfell in name, but the cost was staggering. The letter also hinted at a new threat from beyond the wall. Rumors that the White Walkers had been seen near the edge of the haunted forest. The Night's Watch sent desperate pleas for aid. Stannis beseeched Gendry to redirect men north. He had begun fortifying Winterfell, but Winter's wrath was intensifying, and the real enemy loomed in the far north. Everything else, Stannis insisted, paled compared to the war for the Dawn. Gendry read the letter under torchlight in Ashmark's main hall. He felt an ache behind his eyes. Tywin remained at large in the west. Ramsay Bolton caused havoc in the north's backcountry. The White Walkers threatened the entire realm. The resources of the south were stretched thin, and somewhere in the Vale, perhaps Sansa Stark lingered, her status unknown. The Targaryen girl, Daenerys, was rumored to march across Essos with dragons. The realm was a patchwork of shifting alliances, battered by war, now facing an otherworldly threat from the cold wastes. He pressed his fists to the table, shoulders sagging. Here he was, a king in name, uncertain if any measure of victory was even possible. He had come so far, toppled Joffrey, secured alliances with the Tyrells, pardoned Stannis. Yet every accomplishment birthed new challenges. He remembered the tang of steel in Tobo Mott's smithy, the simpler satisfaction of shaping iron. That seemed a lifetime ago. At length, he raised his head, summoning the resolve that had carried him through the siege, the battles, and the intrigues of King's Landing. The realm needed him whether he felt ready or not. He picked up quill and parchment, drafting orders. Some men would remain to hold Ashmark, some would stand guard in the west to contain Tywin, but the bulk would pivot north to join Arya and Stannis. They would brace Winterfell, heed the cries of the Night's Watch, and face the threat that men whispered of only in old legends. Margaery would remain in King's Landing, shoring up the crown's base. He prayed she would keep the city from tearing itself apart in his absence. When he sealed the letter, signifying his commands, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He was no longer just the blacksmith's apprentice who stumbled into kingship. He was Gendry Baratheon, the blacksmith king, forging unity and hope where chaos reigned. The road ahead was treacherous and uncertain, but if the storms of war and winter were rising, then he would meet them head-on, hammer in hand, determined not to let the realm break under the weight of ancient evils or old hatreds. The next test of his reign lay in the frozen north, and he would face it as he had faced every challenge before, with the strength of his arm, the fire of his convictions, and the unyielding will he had once used to shape iron in the heart of a blazing forge. In the hall's silence, he drew the onyx pendant from beneath his tunic, rubbing a thumb along the carved stag's head. This was his legacy, for better or worse. The realm might see him as Robert Reborn or a bastard upstart, but he would strive to prove worthy of the crown, and worthy of the people who had placed their trust in him. Tomorrow he would ride for the north, to fight not merely for a throne, but for the living against the coming darkness. He took one last breath in the quiet hush of Ashmark's hall, thinking of Arya, of Margaery, of all those who believed in him. Then he left to prepare for the journey into Winter's heart, the hammer of a king at his side, and the burdens of a kingdom on his shoulders. If the legends were true, if the dead truly walked, the forging of steel and alliances would be needed more than ever. In that purpose, at least, Gendry felt a strange sense of belonging. For a blacksmith's skill was not only to create, but to take raw chaos and shape it into something strong enough to endure any storm.